There are stories that shaped civilizations, stories that inspired empires, and stories that continue to influence billions of people across the world. Yet among the greatest names in sacred history, one prophet is often remembered only in passing, standing quietly between the towering figures of Abraham and Jacob. His life was not defined by spectacular miracles witnessed by entire nations, nor by wars that reshaped kingdoms. Instead, his greatness was woven into unwavering faith, remarkable patience, and a covenant that would alter the destiny of humanity forever. Every step he took preserved a divine promise that stretched across generations, linking ancient Mesopotamia to the deserts of Canaan and eventually to the birth of entire civilizations. His name was Ishaq, known in English as Isaac, a prophet chosen by Allah, a beloved son of Prophet Ibrahim, and the father of Prophet Yaqub. Through him would emerge generations of prophets whose stories still echo across synagogues, churches, and mosques today. But beyond the familiar names lies a forgotten world filled with political intrigue, powerful kingdoms, tribal migrations, devastating famines, sacred covenants, and extraordinary acts of devotion. This is not merely the story of one man. It is the story of how one family became the center of sacred history. More than 4,000 years ago, the ancient Near East stood at the crossroads of emerging civilizations. Massive cities rose from the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia while caravans crossed endless deserts carrying copper, incense, spices, and precious textiles. Kings competed for power, temples dominated skylines, and countless gods were worshipped by people who believed every mountain, river, and star possessed its own divine spirit. Humanity had achieved remarkable advances in architecture, trade, and agriculture, yet spiritually it had drifted far from the pure worship taught by the earliest prophets. Idolatry flourished across the lands. Stone statues were decorated with gold and silver, priests claimed authority over mysterious rituals, and rulers often declared themselves chosen by their gods. It was into this world that Allah raised Prophet Ibrahim, whose unwavering belief in one creator challenged the foundations of pagan civilization. His struggle against idol worship would become one of history's greatest examples of faith, eventually leading him to leave his homeland in obedience to Allah's command. That journey would lay the foundation for everything that followed, including the miraculous birth of Ishaq. The world into which Ishaq would eventually be born was one of constant movement. Tribes rarely remained in a single location for generations. Families traveled with enormous herds of sheep, goats, cattle, and camels in search of fertile grazing lands and reliable sources of water. Wells determined survival, and disputes over them could spark conflicts lasting decades. Hospitality became one of the highest virtues because travelers crossing harsh deserts depended upon the kindness of strangers. Wealth was measured not by coins stored inside vaults but by livestock, servants, tents, fertile fields, and the size of one's household. Every family maintained strong tribal loyalties, while elders preserved history through oral tradition long before written records became widespread. It was an age when promises carried enormous weight, family honor determined social standing, and marriages often shaped alliances between powerful clans. The region known today as the Levant occupied extraordinary importance within the ancient world. Stretching across parts of modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, it connected Egypt to Mesopotamia through major trade routes. Merchants, diplomats, soldiers, and nomadic shepherds constantly crossed these lands, bringing with them languages, customs, technologies, and religious beliefs from distant civilizations. The land of Canaan, where much of Ishaq's life would unfold, contained fertile valleys, rolling hills, vineyards, olive groves, and strategically important settlements. Although rich in natural beauty, it remained politically fragmented, divided among numerous city-states ruled by independent kings who frequently competed against one another. Centuries before Ishaq's birth, the descendants of Prophet Nuh had spread across the known world following the Great Flood. Nations multiplied, languages diversified, and cultures evolved according to their environments. Despite these changes, the memory of belief in one creator had not completely disappeared. Fragments of that ancient faith remained among certain individuals, but widespread polytheism gradually overshadowed divine guidance. People carved idols from wood and stone, believing these lifeless objects possessed supernatural authority. Temples became centers of political influence as much as religious devotion, while priests often controlled both economic resources and spiritual practices. In such an environment, those who proclaimed pure monotheism faced ridicule, persecution, and even violence. Among those courageous believers stood Ibrahim, whose journey transformed sacred history forever. Born in Mesopotamia, he openly rejected idol worship despite living within a society deeply committed to pagan traditions. According to the Quran, he questioned the worship of celestial bodies, demonstrating through reason that neither stars, the moon, nor the sun deserved devotion because each disappeared according to a greater power. His arguments challenged the intellectual foundations of idolatry, revealing the existence of one eternal creator beyond all creation. This uncompromising faith eventually brought him into direct conflict with powerful rulers who viewed his message as a threat to established authority. Islamic tradition describes Ibrahim surviving the famous trial of being thrown into an enormous fire, only for Allah to command the flames to become cool and peaceful. This miracle established Ibrahim's status as one of the greatest prophets and demonstrated that worldly power remains insignificant before divine will. Eventually, Allah commanded him to migrate, leaving behind familiar lands in pursuit of a future known only to his Creator. Accompanied by his wife Sarah and later joined by other members of his household, Ibrahim traveled across vast deserts until reaching the blessed land of Canaan. Yet despite receiving immense blessings, one profound sorrow remained within Ibrahim's heart. Years passed without a child from his beloved wife Sarah. In the ancient world, children represented not only personal joy but also the continuation of family heritage, protection in old age, and the preservation of tribal identity. As Ibrahim advanced in age, human expectations suggested that fatherhood had become impossible. Sarah herself had entered old age beyond the normal years of childbearing. Every ordinary measure indicated that their hopes would never be fulfilled. Still, prophets do not measure possibilities according to ordinary human limitations. Their trust rests upon the limitless power of Allah. The Quran repeatedly presents Ibrahim as a model of complete submission, describing him as truthful, patient, grateful, and devoted entirely to his Lord. Although he longed for righteous descendants, he never allowed personal disappointment to weaken his faith. Instead, his prayers reflected humility, hope, and unwavering confidence in divine wisdom. His life teaches that sincere believers continue trusting Allah even when circumstances appear impossible. Long before Ishaq entered the world, Allah had already begun unfolding a plan extending far beyond one family. This divine plan would eventually produce prophets including Yaqub, Yusuf, Musa, Harun, Dawood, Sulayman, Zachariah, Yahya, Isa, and many others. Entire nations would trace their spiritual heritage to promises established through Ibrahim and fulfilled through Ishaq. Unknown to the surrounding kingdoms obsessed with political conquest and material wealth, the most significant events of human history were quietly developing inside the tents of a faithful shepherd whose greatest treasure was not gold, armies, or kingdoms, but absolute trust in his Creator. The deserts of Canaan witnessed countless caravans passing beneath endless skies, unaware that among these humble camps lived individuals whose names would one day be remembered by billions. Kings who once ruled magnificent cities would fade into obscurity. Their palaces would become ruins buried beneath layers of sand and stone. Their monuments would crumble, their dynasties disappear, and their languages evolve beyond recognition. Yet the legacy of Ibrahim would endure through generations because it rested upon revelation rather than earthly power. As the years advanced, visitors occasionally arrived at Ibrahim's encampment seeking rest, food, and protection. Hospitality remained one of his defining characteristics. Travelers found generous welcome beneath his tents regardless of their origin. This reputation for kindness reflected not merely cultural custom but sincere obedience to Allah, who loves those who honor guests and care for strangers. Little did anyone realize that one extraordinary visit would soon transform sorrow into unimaginable joy and announce one of the greatest miracles recorded in sacred history. The birth of Ishaq was approaching, not through ordinary human expectation, but through a promise spoken by the Creator of the heavens and the earth. The elderly couple who had spent decades waiting with patient hearts stood on the edge of witnessing a miracle that would forever reshape the history of prophecy. Before Ishaq could become a prophet, before he could raise Yaqub, before generations of prophets emerged from his descendants, heaven itself would deliver astonishing news that defied every law of nature known to mankind. That remarkable moment marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary chapters in sacred history, where divine promises overcame human impossibility and where faith became stronger than time itself. The sun was slowly descending beyond the hills of Canaan, painting the sky with shades of crimson and gold. A gentle breeze swept across the open plains where the tents of Prophet Ibrahim stood surrounded by flocks of sheep, grazing cattle, and faithful servants carrying out the day's final tasks. Nothing about that evening appeared unusual. The animals returned calmly from pasture, children played near the wells, and smoke rose gently from cooking fires. Yet unseen by every human eye, one of the most extraordinary moments in sacred history was about to unfold. The visitors approaching Ibrahim's camp were unlike any travelers he had ever welcomed before. Hospitality formed the heart of Ibrahim's character. In an age when the desert could become a graveyard for weary travelers, welcoming strangers was considered both an act of honor and an obligation of compassion. Islamic scholars narrate that Ibrahim rarely ate a meal without inviting guests to share it. Whether rich or poor, familiar or unknown, anyone arriving at his camp received generous treatment. This noble habit reflected the kindness that Allah had placed within his heart. As the visitors drew near, Ibrahim immediately rose to greet them with warmth and respect. According to the Quran, he did not hesitate or question their identity. Instead, he hurried to prepare the finest meal available. A healthy roasted calf was selected, carefully prepared, and presented before the guests with sincere generosity. Every action demonstrated humility rather than pride. He expected nothing in return except the opportunity to honor those who had entered his home. Yet something unexpected occurred. The guests did not reach for the food. In the traditions of the ancient Near East, refusing a meal often signaled hostility or danger. Ibrahim noticed that the visitors remained completely still. They neither ate nor touched the carefully prepared feast. For a brief moment, concern entered his heart. Had he unknowingly offended them? Were these men carrying troubling news? Were they enemies disguised as travelers? The Quran beautifully captures this human moment, describing how Ibrahim began to feel apprehensive when he saw that their hands did not reach toward the food. Then the visitors spoke. "Do not fear." With those words, the atmosphere changed completely. These were no ordinary travelers wandering across the wilderness. They were angels sent directly by Allah. Classical Islamic scholars including Ibn Kathir, Al-Tabari, Al-Qurtubi, and Al-Baghawi explain that the angels had been dispatched for two great missions. Their first mission was to deliver joyful news to Ibrahim and Sarah. Their second mission would take them toward the cities where Prophet Lut lived, bringing Allah's judgment upon the corrupt people of Sodom. Before speaking about punishment, however, Allah chose to begin with mercy. The angels announced astonishing news that seemed impossible according to every human calculation. They informed Ibrahim that Allah would bless him with a son named Ishaq. Not merely a child. A prophet. A righteous servant. A continuation of the covenant. A father whose descendants would carry divine revelation across generations. For a moment, time itself seemed to stand still. Ibrahim had spent decades waiting. His beard had turned white. His body had grown old. His strength was no longer that of youth. Sarah had also advanced into old age, long beyond the years in which women normally bear children. Every physician of the ancient world would have declared such a pregnancy impossible. Every human expectation had reached its conclusion years earlier. Yet Allah's promise was only beginning. The Quran described Sarah's reaction with remarkable realism. Hearing the astonishing announcement, she approached in amazement. Overwhelmed by the impossible news, she expressed surprise that she would bear a child despite her advanced age while her husband was also elderly. Her words reflected natural human astonishment rather than doubt in Allah's power. She exclaimed that such an event seemed extraordinary. The angels immediately reminded her that nothing is difficult for Allah. Their response became one of the timeless lessons repeated throughout Islamic history. Do you wonder at the decree of Allah? For the Creator who fashioned Adam without parents, created Hawa from Adam, parted seas, revived the dead, and formed the heavens from nothing, granting a child to an elderly couple required no effort whatsoever. Human beings measure possibility according to biology. Allah measures possibility according to His will. Whenever He intends something, He simply says, "Be," and it comes into existence. This miracle represented far more than the birth of one child. It confirmed that divine promises never expire. Years do not weaken Allah's decree. Old age cannot cancel His mercy. Natural laws remain subject to the one who established them. The announcement carried another astonishing promise. Not only would Ibrahim receive Ishaq, but after Ishaq would come Yaqub. The angels informed them that this future son would himself become the father of another prophet. In one announcement, Allah revealed 3 generations of prophetic blessing. Ibrahim would witness the birth of his son, and before his earthly life ended, he would also know that his grandson had already been promised by divine revelation. Very few individuals in human history received such extraordinary glad tidings. The Quran repeatedly emphasizes this blessing, describing Ishaq as one of Allah's righteous prophets and announcing him as a gift rather than merely a biological child. Islamic commentators explain that this distinction carries profound significance. Children are often viewed as possessions. Allah teaches believers to view them as trusts. Ishaq did not belong to Ibrahim. He belonged first to Allah. His mission, his character, his descendants, and his future had already been written by divine wisdom long before his birth. Meanwhile, the surrounding civilizations continued pursuing wealth, conquest, and political dominance. Egyptian officials expanded influence along trade routes. City kings in Canaan negotiated alliances. Merchants crossed deserts carrying expensive goods worth fortunes. Military commanders prepared campaigns against rival kingdoms. None of them realized that history's greatest treasure was not being born inside a royal palace. It would arrive quietly inside the tent of an elderly prophet living as a humble shepherd. History often remembers emperors because they built monuments. Heaven remembers prophets because they built faith. The contrast could not have been greater. Kings depended upon armies. Ibrahim depended upon Allah. Rulers trusted walls of stone. Ibrahim trusted promises from heaven. Empires expanded through force. The covenant expanded through righteousness. This difference would eventually reshape civilization itself. According to many classical historians, news of miraculous births often spread rapidly among neighboring tribes. Although not everyone understood the divine nature of the event, Ibrahim's household already enjoyed enormous respect throughout the region because of his honesty, generosity, and unwavering devotion. Tribal elders recognized him as a man whose words carried integrity. Travelers spoke highly of his hospitality wherever they journeyed. His reputation reached settlements far beyond his own encampment. Yet Ibrahim never sought fame. His greatest ambition remained pleasing Allah. This humility distinguished every prophet from worldly rulers. The Quran never portrays prophets chasing recognition. Instead, honor follows them naturally because sincerity attracts divine blessing. Days passed. The promise remained alive. Every sunrise carried renewed anticipation. Every prayer deepened gratitude. Sarah, whose heart had known years of silent longing, now carried within her the fulfillment of Allah's mercy. The impossible had become reality. The elderly woman who once believed motherhood had passed forever now experienced hope unlike anything she had imagined. For Ibrahim, every passing day became another reminder that Allah never forgets the prayers of His righteous servants. Sometimes the answer arrives quickly. Sometimes it arrives after decades. Sometimes it arrives when every worldly expectation has completely disappeared. But when Allah's appointed time comes, no force in creation can delay His decree. The miracle of Ishaq's coming birth would soon become one of the greatest signs preserved not only in the Quran but also remembered throughout Jewish and Christian traditions. Across centuries and continents, believers would recall the elderly couple whose faith remained unbroken until Allah transformed impossibility into certainty. The child promised by the angels had not yet entered the world. But heaven had already written his destiny. He would grow into a prophet whose patience reflected his father, whose descendants would inherit revelation, and whose name would become inseparable from the sacred history of humanity itself. The silence of the desert concealed a future that would change the world forever. The months that followed unfolded with a quiet sense of anticipation unlike anything Ibrahim's household had ever experienced. Every sunrise reminded the elderly prophet that Allah's promise was steadily moving toward fulfillment. The same desert winds that had once carried only memories of unanswered prayers now seemed to whisper hope across the hills of Canaan. Servants noticed a renewed light in Ibrahim's face. Sarah, whose heart had long accepted a life without children, now carried within her the miracle announced by the angels. No human physician could explain it. No tribal elder could compare it to any ordinary event. This was not simply an unexpected pregnancy. It was a living testimony that Allah alone controls life, death, time, and every law governing creation. The surrounding tribes continued their ordinary lives without realizing they were witnessing one of history's greatest miracles. Shepherds guided their flocks across open valleys. Merchants traveled between Egypt and Mesopotamia carrying spices, olive oil, copper, fine wool, and precious stones. Farmers harvested barley and wheat while city rulers negotiated alliances and prepared defenses against rival kingdoms. Nations believed their future depended upon military strength and economic prosperity. Yet Allah was preparing something far greater inside the humble dwelling of His prophet. History would eventually remember kings only through broken ruins buried beneath layers of earth, while the family living quietly among the tents would become the spiritual ancestors of billions of believers. At last, the appointed time arrived. Sarah gave birth exactly as Allah had promised. The cries of a newborn child echoed through Ibrahim's camp, breaking decades of silence that had once filled the household with quiet longing. Tears of gratitude flowed from eyes that had waited an entire lifetime for this moment. Every difficulty, every year of patience, every whispered prayer beneath the stars had now found its answer. The elderly prophet gently held his son for the very first time. This child was not merely the fulfillment of personal hope. He was the fulfillment of divine promise. Allah Himself had chosen his name before his birth. Ishaq. Classical Islamic scholars explain that the name carries the meaning of joy and laughter, beautifully reflecting Sarah's astonishment and happiness when she first heard the angels announce the impossible news. Jewish tradition similarly associates the Hebrew name Yitzhak with laughter because Sarah laughed in amazement upon hearing she would bear a son in old age. Although Islamic and biblical traditions describe certain details differently, both preserve the central reality that Ishaq's birth was miraculous and entirely dependent upon Allah's will. The Quran mentions Ishaq with profound honor. He is consistently described as a righteous servant, a prophet, and a blessing granted directly by Allah. Unlike ordinary historical figures whose greatness developed gradually through worldly achievements, Ishaq's honor began before his birth because Allah had already selected him for prophethood. The Quran records that Allah gave glad tidings of Ishaq as a prophet from among the righteous. This statement carries immense significance. Allah did not merely promise a son. He promised guidance. He promised revelation. He promised a future prophet whose descendants would continue the mission of calling humanity to worship the one Creator. For Ibrahim, fatherhood became far more than a personal blessing. It became a sacred responsibility. Every prophet understood that children are trusts placed temporarily in the care of parents. They belong ultimately to Allah, who entrusts mothers and fathers with nurturing faith, character, wisdom, and obedience. Ibrahim therefore approached fatherhood with profound humility. Rather than viewing Ishaq as the source of pride, he viewed him as another opportunity to serve Allah faithfully. The environment in which Ishaq spent his earliest years differed greatly from modern childhood. There were no cities filled with towering buildings, paved roads, or schools with written textbooks. Life revolved around family, livestock, seasonal migration, and constant dependence upon nature. Children learned by observing adults. They watched fathers negotiate with neighboring tribes, mothers prepare food, shepherds protect animals from predators, and elders settle disputes according to justice and honor. Young Ishaq grew surrounded by examples of kindness and faith. Every morning he witnessed his father's devotion during prayer. Every evening he listened to stories describing Allah's creation, the destruction of earlier nations, and the importance of worshipping only the one true God. Unlike the children of surrounding pagan tribes who grew up surrounded by carved idols and elaborate temple rituals, Ishaq learned from infancy that no created object deserves worship. The heavens pointed toward their Creator. The earth reflected His wisdom. The stars obeyed His command. Everything in existence testified to His greatness. This understanding became the foundation of Ishaq's entire life. According to many scholars of tafsir, Ibrahim invested extraordinary care in raising his son because he recognized that future generations depended upon the values established during childhood. Character, they explain, develops long before positions of leadership arrive. A prophet's public mission begins with private discipline inside the home. Sarah likewise played an essential role in Ishaq's upbringing. Although the Quran provides only brief references to her, Islamic tradition honors her as one of history's most righteous women. She had endured years of disappointment without allowing bitterness to replace faith. Her patience became one of the greatest examples of trust in Allah's wisdom. Having received her son through miraculous mercy, she understood that every moment with him represented a priceless blessing rather than something to be taken for granted. As Ishaq grew older, he developed within an environment unlike any other child on earth. His father was Khalilullah, the intimate friend of Allah. Revelation regularly descended upon their household. Angels had personally visited their home. The covenant of prophethood rested upon their family. These extraordinary circumstances did not produce arrogance. Instead, they produced deeper humility. The prophets consistently demonstrated that closeness to Allah increases gratitude rather than pride. Beyond Ibrahim's camp, however, the world remained spiritually divided. Throughout Canaan, temples dedicated to Baal, Asherah, El, and numerous local deities attracted large crowds. Sacrifices were offered before stone statues believed to control rain, fertility, harvests, and victory in battle. Astrology influenced political decisions. Fortune tellers claimed knowledge of hidden realities. Priests collected offerings while convincing ordinary people that carved idols possessed supernatural power. The contrast between Ibrahim's household and surrounding society became increasingly clear. One family worshipped the unseen Creator. Entire civilizations worshipped created things. One household relied upon revelation. Powerful kingdoms relied upon superstition. One camp sought eternal truth. Many cities pursued temporary prosperity. This spiritual difference would shape Ishaq's mission throughout his life. Classical historians describe Canaan during this period as a mosaic of independent city-states connected through trade yet divided politically. Fortified settlements stood upon hills overlooking fertile valleys. Wealthy merchants exchanged goods arriving from Egypt, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and Arabia. Different languages echoed through crowded marketplaces. Diplomats carried messages between rulers while nomadic tribes maintained lifestyles largely independent of urban governments. Growing up amid this diversity prepared Ishaq for future leadership. He learned that faith must remain firm regardless of changing cultures. Truth does not depend upon majority opinion. A prophet cannot adjust revelation merely to satisfy society. Instead, society must be invited back toward divine guidance. This principle distinguished every messenger sent by Allah throughout history. Meanwhile, Ibrahim observed his son's development with immense gratitude. Every new word spoken by the child reminded him of Allah's fulfilled promise. Every smile reflected divine mercy. Every passing year confirmed that nothing is impossible for the Lord of the heavens and the earth. Yet Ibrahim also understood another profound reality. Miraculous births do not guarantee easy lives. Every prophet faces trials. Every righteous servant encounters tests. Blessings themselves become responsibilities. Allah had granted Ishaq extraordinary honor, but that honor carried the weight of future prophethood. His childhood would prepare him for a mission extending far beyond his own lifetime. The little boy running through the valleys of Canaan could not yet comprehend that generations of prophets would one day descend from his family. He could not yet imagine that billions of people across thousands of years would remember his name in prayers, scriptures, and sacred history. But Allah already knew. Before Ishaq spoke his first complete sentence, before he tended his first flock, before he learned the responsibilities of leadership, the pages of destiny had already been written. The child born through miracle was growing steadily beneath the watchful care of two of the most righteous believers who had ever walked the earth. And beyond the peaceful hills of Canaan, events were quietly unfolding that would soon reveal another defining chapter in the sacred history of Ibrahim's remarkable family. As the years passed, the child once cradled in Sarah's arms began to mature into a thoughtful and gentle young man. Every season left its mark upon the land of Canaan. Spring covered the valleys with wildflowers, summer brought long days beneath the blazing sun, autumn filled the orchards with ripe fruit, and winter rains restored life to the dry hills. Ishaq grew with the rhythm of this land, learning not only how to care for livestock and manage a household but also how to recognize the countless signs of Allah's wisdom reflected throughout creation. Unlike the princes of powerful kingdoms who spent their youth inside magnificent palaces surrounded by luxury, Ishaq lived a life of humility. His home consisted of tents that could be moved whenever pasture became scarce. His wealth was measured by faith before possessions. He learned to ride across open plains, guide shepherds, protect flocks from wild animals, and locate hidden wells that sustained entire communities. These were not merely practical skills. They taught patience, responsibility, endurance, and gratitude, qualities that every prophet would eventually need. The Quran repeatedly emphasizes that Allah chooses His prophets based on righteousness rather than worldly status. Ishaq's upbringing reflected this divine pattern perfectly. There were no royal ceremonies celebrating his future. No armies marched in his honor. No kings announced his greatness. Instead, Allah prepared him quietly through ordinary moments that gradually shaped an extraordinary character. Prophet Ibrahim devoted himself to teaching his son the reality of Tawhid, the absolute oneness of Allah. Every lesson centered upon one unchanging truth. There is no deity worthy of worship except Allah. This belief was far more than a statement repeated during worship. It became the foundation through which Ishaq understood every aspect of existence. He learned that the stars decorating the night sky moved according to Allah's command. The rain nourishing the earth descended only by His permission. The wind crossing the desert carried no independent power. Mountains, rivers, animals, and mankind all remained completely dependent upon their Creator. Ibrahim also taught his son the history of humanity. He described how Allah created Adam from clay and honored him above many of his creations. He told the story of Hawa, the garden, and the first test. He explained the tragedy of Kabil and Habil, demonstrating how jealousy could corrupt the human heart. He recounted the mission of Prophet Nuh and the great flood that purified the earth after generations rejected divine guidance. He spoke about the destruction of arrogant nations that believed worldly power could protect them from Allah's judgment. Each story carried lessons rather than entertainment. Each generation revealed the consequences of either obedience or rebellion. Young Ishaq listened carefully, recognizing that history was not merely about the past. It served as guidance for the future. According to classical Islamic scholars, prophets inherit wisdom through revelation, but they also grow through education, observation, and experience. Ibrahim therefore encouraged his son to think deeply rather than accept ideas blindly. This reflected Ibrahim's own method of reasoning described throughout the Quran, where he invited people to reflect upon the heavens, the earth, and the signs of Allah visible throughout creation. As Ishaq matured, his reputation spread among neighboring tribes. Travelers who visited Ibrahim's camp noticed the young man's remarkable manners. He spoke gently. He listened carefully. He treated servants with kindness. He honored guests regardless of their background. He displayed neither arrogance nor impatience despite belonging to one of the most respected families in the region. Character always reveals itself through small actions long before great responsibilities arrive. The people of Canaan observed these qualities with admiration. Although many remained attached to pagan traditions, they could not deny the integrity of Ibrahim's household. Honesty became their reputation. Justice became their identity. Compassion became their legacy. These qualities distinguished them from many tribal leaders who pursued influence through intimidation or deception. Meanwhile, Prophet Ibrahim continued fulfilling Allah's mission across the region. He traveled between settlements, inviting people to abandon idols and worship the one true Creator. Some accepted his message with sincerity, while others rejected it, unwilling to abandon traditions inherited from their ancestors. This pattern had accompanied nearly every prophet before him. Truth often begins with only a few believers while the majority resist change. Young Ishaq accompanied his father on many of these journeys. As they crossed valleys and hills, Ibrahim pointed toward the surrounding landscape. He explained that these lands belonged ultimately to Allah. Kings might claim ownership. Empires might establish borders. Armies might conquer cities. But every mountain, every river, every tree, and every grain of sand remained part of Allah's creation. Human authority would eventually disappear. The Creator alone remains forever. These journeys also exposed Ishaq to the diversity of ancient Canaan. Bustling marketplaces echoed with many languages. Caravans arrived carrying cedar wood from Lebanon, gold from Egypt, fine fabrics from Mesopotamia, and fragrant incense from southern Arabia. Nomadic shepherds negotiated grazing rights. Merchants exchanged livestock for grain and olive oil. Craftsmen shaped bronze tools using techniques passed down through generations. The region stood at the center of international trade, connecting civilizations stretching thousands of miles apart. Yet despite this impressive commercial activity, spiritual confusion remained widespread. Many people believed prosperity depended upon pleasing idols. Farmers prayed before carved statues seeking rain. Warriors offered sacrifices before battles hoping for victory. Families carried small household gods wherever they traveled. Entire communities feared the imagined anger of lifeless objects carved by human hands. Whenever Ishaq witnessed these practices, Ibrahim reminded him of an essential truth. If people create their own gods, those gods cannot create people. This simple principle destroyed the foundation of idolatry. A creator cannot depend upon the hands of those who claim to worship him. The one worthy of worship must be eternal, independent, all-powerful, and the creator of everything. Only Allah fulfills these attributes. Islamic tradition emphasizes that Ishaq accepted these teachings wholeheartedly. Unlike many young people influenced by surrounding cultures, he never became attracted to pagan customs. His faith remained firm because it rested upon certainty rather than imitation. As he entered adulthood, Allah continued refining his character. Patience became one of his defining qualities. He never rushed decisions. He never spoke harshly without reason. He remained calm during difficulties. His gentle nature earned respect even among those who disagreed with his beliefs. The Quran describes Allah's prophets as examples of righteousness, wisdom, and steadfastness. Ishaq embodied these qualities long before receiving the responsibilities of prophethood publicly. During these years, another important relationship continued developing within Ibrahim's family. Although Ishaq and his older half-brother Ismail had grown under different circumstances, they shared something far greater than blood. They shared faith. Modern discussions sometimes portray the descendants of Ishaq and Ismail as natural rivals from the very beginning, but Islamic sources do not describe hostility between the two prophets themselves. Both were righteous servants chosen by Allah. Both honored their father. Both dedicated their lives to worshipping the one Creator. Their descendants would eventually become distinct nations with different historical experiences, yet the two brothers themselves remained united by obedience to Allah. Ibrahim loved both sons deeply. Each had a unique role within Allah's divine plan. Through Ismail would emerge the Arab tribes and, generations later, the final prophet, Muhammad. Through Ishaq would come Yaqub, followed by Yusuf, Musa, Harun, Dawud, Sulaiman, Zachariah, Yahya, Isa, and many other prophets sent to the children of Israel. Allah's wisdom assigned different missions without diminishing the honor of either prophet. As Ishaq approached full maturity, everyone around him recognized that he possessed unusual wisdom for his age. His words reflected careful thought. His actions reflected discipline. His heart reflected sincerity. But the greatest chapter of his life had not yet begun. Soon, Allah would bless him with a family of his own, and through that family the covenant established with Ibrahim would continue into another generation. The future of sacred history was preparing to unfold once again, not through armies or empires, but through a righteous household devoted entirely to the worship of Allah. By the time Ishaq reached adulthood, the respect his family commanded throughout Canaan had become firmly established. Tribal elders sought Ibrahim's advice during disputes. Travelers spoke of his honesty in distant settlements. Merchants trusted his word without demanding guarantees, and neighboring clans recognized that the household of Ibrahim lived according to principles unlike those of the surrounding nations. Their strength did not come from large armies or fortified cities. It came from unwavering faith in Allah and a reputation built over decades of truthfulness. For Ishaq, these years marked the transition from learning to responsibility. Childhood had been a season of observation. Adulthood required action. He now helped oversee the growing flocks, managed servants, settled disagreements among shepherds, and represented his father's household during meetings with neighboring tribes. Every decision reflected the values he had learned since childhood. Justice came before personal gain. Mercy stood beside firmness. Truth remained more valuable than wealth. In the ancient world, marriage was far more than the union of two individuals. It connected families, strengthened tribal alliances, and shaped the future of entire generations. Yet for prophets, marriage carried an even greater purpose. It was the beginning of another righteous household through which Allah's guidance could continue. Prophet Ibrahim understood this better than anyone. He had witnessed how societies slowly drifted away from Tawhid when families abandoned faith. He knew that choosing a righteous spouse mattered more than choosing one from a wealthy or politically influential family. As Ishaq approached the age of marriage, Ibrahim became deeply concerned about finding a woman whose belief matched the values Allah had established within their household. The people living throughout Canaan largely remained attached to idol worship. Many families possessed wealth, influence, and noble ancestry according to worldly standards, yet they devoted themselves to false gods. Ibrahim could not accept such a foundation for the next generation of prophets. According to Islamic historical traditions and the account preserved in the book of Genesis, Ibrahim decided that Ishaq should marry a woman from among his extended relatives rather than from the pagan tribes surrounding Canaan. The Quran does not describe this journey in detail. However, classical Muslim historians, while distinguishing between authentic revelation and historical reports inherited from earlier traditions, generally mention that Ibrahim entrusted this mission to one of his most loyal servants. Jewish and Christian traditions identify this servant as Eliezer of Damascus, though Islamic sources do not confirm his name with certainty. The elderly servant received careful instructions. He was to travel far to the region where Ibrahim's relatives still lived. He was not to choose a wife based upon beauty alone. He was not to seek wealth. He was not to pursue political advantage. His primary concern would be faith, character, modesty, and righteousness. The journey itself was enormous. Crossing the ancient Near East required weeks of travel through dangerous wilderness. Caravans faced intense heat during the day, freezing nights, sandstorms, rocky mountain passes, and the constant threat of bandits. Wells became lifelines scattered across vast stretches of desert. Every successful journey depended upon careful planning, experienced guides, and complete reliance upon Allah. As the servant approached the city where Ibrahim's relatives lived, he understood the weight of his responsibility. He paused beside a well outside the settlement. Throughout the ancient Near East, wells served as gathering places where families collected water each evening before sunset. Young women often came carrying clay jars upon their shoulders, drawing water not only for their households but also for livestock. Standing beside the well, the servant turned his heart toward Allah. He prayed sincerely for guidance. He asked Allah to make the right woman unmistakably clear through her kindness and generosity. This moment illustrates one of the timeless lessons preserved throughout sacred history. Even trusted servants of righteous prophets did not rely solely upon personal judgment. They sought Allah's guidance before making life-changing decisions. Soon, young women from the town began arriving with their water jars. Among them appeared a woman whose character immediately distinguished her from the others. Her name was Rivka, known in English as Rebecca. Historical sources describe her as modest, dignified, hardworking, and compassionate. When the servant politely requested a drink of water, Rebecca willingly offered it without hesitation. Then, noticing the thirsty camels accompanying him, she voluntarily drew water again and again until every animal had been satisfied. This was no small act. A single thirsty camel can drink an astonishing amount of water. Providing enough water for an entire caravan required tremendous physical effort. Rebecca expected no reward. She acted purely out of generosity. The servant quietly watched in amazement. His prayer had been answered before his eyes. True character reveals itself not during moments of comfort but through acts of service performed without expectation of recognition. When Rebecca returned home, events unfolded rapidly. Her family welcomed the travelers according to the customs of hospitality practiced throughout the region. The servant explained the purpose of his journey. He described Ibrahim, his miraculous son Ishaq, and the blessings Allah had bestowed upon their household. Most importantly, he spoke of faith. Marriage into Ibrahim's family meant joining a household dedicated entirely to the worship of the one true God. According to historical tradition, Rebekah and her family accepted the proposal. Before departing, her relatives asked whether she herself wished to undertake the long journey. Her answer was simple. "I will go." With those words, Rebekah left behind her childhood home, trusting Allah to guide her future. The caravan traveled back across the wilderness toward Canaan. Days became weeks. Mountains gave way to valleys. The familiar landscapes surrounding Ibrahim's encampment gradually appeared on the horizon. Meanwhile, Ishaq continued his daily routine, unaware that one of the greatest changes in his life was approaching. One evening, as the sun descended over the fields, Ishaq walked alone across the countryside. The book of Genesis describes him as meditating in the field during the evening. Although the Quran does not mention this specific event, many Muslim historians have noted it as part of the historical narrative while emphasizing that revelation alone remains the ultimate source of certainty. From a distance, Ishaq noticed a caravan approaching. Rebekah also saw a solitary figure walking peacefully across the land. She asked the servant about the identity of the man. When she learned that he was Ishaq, she respectfully covered herself before meeting him. The meeting itself was quiet. No royal celebration. No grand ceremony. No display of worldly extravagance. Two righteous individuals met under the vast skies of Canaan, beginning a marriage that would become one of the most significant unions in sacred history. Their relationship rested not upon political ambition but upon shared belief in Allah. For Ishaq, Rebekah became a source of companionship, comfort, and support. For Rebekah, Ishaq became a husband whose greatest qualities were faith, wisdom, and kindness. Classical Islamic scholars consistently emphasize that successful families begin with righteousness before prosperity. Wealth may disappear. Beauty fades. Political influence changes. But faith creates a foundation capable of surviving every trial. Allah was preparing this new household for responsibilities greater than either husband or wife could yet imagine. Generations of prophets had already been promised through Ishaq. The covenant given to Ibrahim had not ended with the birth of one miraculous son. It would continue through another generation. Yet before those promises reached fulfillment, Ishaq and Rebekah would face a painful trial that echoed the very test once experienced by Ibrahim and Sarah. Years passed. The household remained peaceful. But no children were born. The silence that had once filled Ibrahim's tents before Ishaq's miraculous birth now settled upon Ishaq's own home. History seemed ready to repeat one of its most profound lessons. Sometimes Allah delays His blessings, not as a punishment, but to teach His servants that every gift arrives only at the perfect time decreed by Him. The next chapter of Ishaq's life would reveal whether the son born through a miracle had inherited not only his father's faith, but also his extraordinary patience. The peaceful years of Ishaq and Rebekah's marriage unfolded beneath the wide skies of Canaan. Their household reflected harmony, kindness, and devotion to Allah. Shepherds faithfully tended the flocks, servants carried out their daily responsibilities with respect, and travelers continued finding generous hospitality whenever they visited the camp. Outwardly, everything appeared blessed. Yet within the quiet walls of their family life remained a sorrow known only too well by those who had come before them. Years passed. Still, no child was born. For many families of the ancient world, childlessness often became a source of public shame. Tribal societies viewed children as the continuation of family honor, inheritance, and protection for future generations. Couples without children frequently endured whispered conversations, misunderstanding, and pity from those around them. Many believed that prosperity could be measured by the size of one's household. But prophets understood something deeper. A person's value before Allah is never measured by how many children they have. It is measured by faith, sincerity, patience, and obedience. Ishaq remembered the stories his father had shared throughout his childhood. He remembered how Ibrahim and Sarah had waited decades before Allah fulfilled his promise. He remembered that miracles arrive according to Allah's timing, not human expectation. Rather than allowing disappointment to harden his heart, Ishaq turned toward his Lord with complete humility. The Quran briefly records this beautiful moment without unnecessary detail. Allah tells us that Ishaq prayed sincerely for his wife because she was unable to conceive. Then Allah answered his prayer. This short verse contains profound wisdom. Ishaq did not complain. He did not lose hope. He did not question Allah's justice. Instead, he made sincere dua. The Quran teaches believers that prayer is not merely an act of worship performed during times of comfort. It becomes most powerful during moments of helplessness. Human beings often discover the greatest strength of faith when they finally recognize their own limitations. Classical scholars such as Ibn Kathir explain that Ishaq's prayer demonstrated complete dependence upon Allah. Although many years had passed, he never believed the door of mercy had closed. Every day remained another opportunity for Allah's decree to unfold. Eventually, that decree arrived. Allah accepted the prayer of his prophet. Rebekah conceived. The household that had patiently waited now prepared to welcome the next generation of Allah's covenant. But this pregnancy differed from ordinary pregnancies. Rebekah experienced unusual physical struggles unlike anything she had expected. According to the historical account preserved in Genesis, the children within her womb struggled intensely, causing her deep concern. Islamic sources do not provide extensive details about this event, but many Muslim historians mention it while clearly distinguishing between Quranic revelation and historical reports inherited from earlier traditions. As the months continued, Rebekah sensed that something extraordinary surrounded the children she carried. She did not yet know that her sons would become the ancestors of two great nations whose histories would shape the ancient world for centuries. At the appointed time, she gave birth. The first child emerged covered with reddish hair. He became known as Esau, called Al-Iz in many Islamic historical works. Moments later, another child was born. His tiny hand grasped the heel of his older brother. Because of this remarkable birth, he received the name Yaqub, known in English as Jacob. The names of these two brothers would echo throughout history. One would become the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. The other would become the ancestor of the Edomite people. Although they entered the world only moments apart, their personalities developed in strikingly different ways. Esau grew into a man who loved the open wilderness. He became a skilled hunter, strong, courageous, and physically adventurous. He enjoyed the excitement of the chase, spending long days crossing mountains and forests in pursuit of wild animals. Yaqub, on the other hand, possessed a quieter nature. He preferred reflection over excitement. He enjoyed remaining close to the family, helping manage the household, caring for livestock, and learning from his father. These differences were not flaws. Allah creates human beings with different strengths and different responsibilities. Neither courage nor gentleness is superior on its own. What matters is how each quality is used in obedience to Allah. Prophet Ishaq treated both sons with love. Like every father, he recognized their unique personalities. He encouraged Esau's strength while nurturing Yaqub's wisdom. His goal was not to make them identical. His goal was to guide each of them toward righteousness. The camp of Ibrahim now echoed with the voices of grandchildren. The elderly prophet watched another generation growing before his eyes. Few blessings brought him greater happiness. Allah had not only fulfilled his promise of granting Ishaq. He had now blessed Ishaq with children of his own. The covenant continued exactly as Allah had declared years earlier when the angels first visited Ibrahim's tent. One promise had become many generations. The miracle was expanding. As Yaqub and Esau grew, Ibrahim devoted time to teaching them just as he had once taught Ishaq. He spoke about Adam. He spoke about Noah. He spoke about the destruction of arrogant nations. He described Allah's mercy toward those who remain patient. He explained that worldly power always fades, while faith remains forever. The young boys listened to stories that had already become the spiritual heritage of their family. Every generation received the same message. Worship Allah alone. Speak the truth. Honor your parents. Care for the weak. Never allow wealth to replace faith. Never allow pride to corrupt the heart. Meanwhile, the political landscape surrounding Canaan continued changing. Powerful kingdoms rose and declined. Trade routes shifted. New rulers claimed authority over neighboring territories. Caravans introduced fresh customs from distant civilizations. Religious practices became increasingly diverse as different peoples settled throughout the region. Despite these constant changes, Ibrahim's family remained remarkably stable. Their identity did not depend upon politics. It depended upon revelation. This stability became one of the defining characteristics of prophetic households. Governments changed. Empires disappeared. But Allah's guidance continued, passing from one prophet to the next. As Ibrahim entered the final years of his earthly life, he found immense peace watching Ishaq lead the household with maturity and wisdom. The young man who had once learned at his father's side had become a capable leader in his own right. He judged fairly. He treated servants kindly. He honored guests generously. He worshipped Allah with complete sincerity. Every quality Ibrahim had hoped to cultivate now appeared clearly in his son. For an elderly father, there are few satisfactions greater than witnessing a child surpass expectations. Yet Ibrahim understood something that every prophet knew. No family, regardless of its righteousness, remains free from future tests. Even households blessed with revelation would encounter moments of hardship. The children growing together inside the same tent would one day face decisions capable of shaping the destiny of nations. The differences already visible between Esau and Yaqub would gradually deepen as they matured into adulthood. Those differences would not merely affect one family. They would influence the course of sacred history itself. But before those events unfolded, another chapter was approaching. The life of Allah's beloved friend, Prophet Ibrahim, was nearing its conclusion. His earthly mission had transformed humanity. His legacy had already extended through Ismail and Ishaq. Soon, the responsibility of preserving the covenant would rest primarily upon the shoulders of his miraculous son, Prophet Ishaq. The age of the father was slowly giving way to the age of the son. And with that transition, a new era in the history of divine revelation was about to begin. Time is relentless. Even the greatest prophets who walked upon the earth, spoke with angels, witnessed miracles, and carried the light of revelation eventually reached the final chapter of their earthly journey. No amount of wisdom could stop the passing of years. No miracle altered the decree that every soul would one day return to its Creator. As the seasons continued changing across the hills of Canaan, Prophet Ibrahim entered the final years of a life unlike any other. His hair had turned completely white. His steps became slower. The powerful voice that had once challenged tyrants and shattered the arguments of idol worshippers had grown softer with age. Yet his faith remained stronger than ever. Looking around his household, Ibrahim saw the fulfillment of promises that had once seemed impossible. Allah had granted him 2 righteous sons, Ismail and Ishaq. Both had become prophets devoted entirely to Tawhid. Through them, the covenant established decades earlier continued to spread across generations. The elderly prophet knew his mission on earth was nearing completion. Although the Quran does not describe Ibrahim's final conversations in detail, Islamic scholars explain that prophets prepare their families before death by reminding them of the most important truth. Not wealth. Not property. Not tribal influence. Faith. The greatest inheritance left by every prophet has never been material possessions. It has always been belief in Allah. The Quran beautifully preserves this reality when describing the advice given to future generations. Worship Allah alone. That simple command carried within it the purpose of every prophet from Adam until Muhammad. Ishaq listened carefully to every lesson his father continued teaching during these final years. Even though he had reached maturity, he never considered himself beyond learning. This humility became one of his greatest qualities. True wisdom begins when a person realizes there is always more to learn. Every conversation with Ibrahim became precious. Every prayer performed beside him became unforgettable. Every journey together across the valleys of Canaan carried memories that Ishaq would treasure for the rest of his life. As Ibrahim's strength gradually declined, the leadership of the household naturally shifted toward Ishaq. He supervised the shepherds. He managed agreements with neighboring tribes. He welcomed visitors with the same generosity his father had always shown. Travelers arriving at the camp noticed that the son had inherited not only Ibrahim's appearance but also his character. His kindness reflected his father's mercy. His honesty reflected his father's integrity. His patience reflected decades of careful upbringing. This peaceful transfer of responsibility illustrates one of the timeless principles established by the prophets. Leadership is not seized. It is earned through character. Allah prepares righteous leaders long before they assume positions of responsibility. The surrounding world, however, remained as unstable as ever. City-states competed for territory. Kings formed temporary alliances before turning against one another. Trade caravans expanded commercial routes connecting Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Arabia. New settlements appeared while older cities fell into decline. Throughout these political changes, Ibrahim's family remained remarkably independent. They did not seek political power. They did not establish kingdoms. Their influence spread through moral leadership rather than military conquest. This distinguished the prophetic household from nearly every ruling dynasty of the ancient world. Many kings desired subjects. The prophets desired believers. Many rulers expanded borders. The prophets expanded hearts. Many governments relied upon fear. The prophets relied upon truth. This difference explains why the names of many ancient emperors are remembered only by archaeologists, while the names of Allah's prophets continue to be spoken by billions of believers every day. Eventually, the day arrived that every family must one day face. Prophet Ibrahim returned to Allah. Although the Quran does not describe the details of his passing, Islamic tradition honors him as one of the greatest messengers ever sent to humanity. His life had stretched across generations. He had challenged kings, survived the fire of Nimrod, left his homeland for Allah's sake, rebuilt the Kaaba with Ismail, received miraculous children in old age, and became the father of prophets whose descendants would illuminate history for centuries. His earthly mission had ended. His legacy had only begun. For Ishaq, losing his father was more than the death of a beloved parent. It marked the passing of the greatest teacher he had ever known. The tent where revelation had descended. The voice that had guided him since childhood. The man whose every action reflected complete submission to Allah. Now those responsibilities rested upon his own shoulders. Grief naturally entered his heart. Islam never teaches believers to suppress human emotion. Even prophets mourned. Even prophets wept. What distinguished them was that sorrow never led them toward despair. Instead, grief drew them closer to Allah. Classical Islamic scholars explain that Ishaq responded exactly as a prophet should. He remained patient. He continued worship. He preserved his father's teachings without alteration. He refused to allow surrounding pagan influences to corrupt the covenant entrusted to his family. This became one of the defining achievements of Ishaq's life. History often celebrates those who establish something new. Yet preserving truth can require equal greatness. Ishaq inherited more than livestock and tents. He inherited responsibility for safeguarding the message of Tawhid. The children growing around him now looked to him for guidance. His wife Rebecca stood beside him with unwavering support. Young Yaqub carefully observed every decision his father made. Esau also matured into adulthood, developing his own strengths and interests. A new generation was watching. Every action performed by Ishaq would shape their understanding of faith. The Quran repeatedly describes Allah's blessings upon Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Yaqub together. This recurring connection emphasizes continuity. Revelation did not begin with one prophet and end with another. Each messenger faithfully carried the same truth from one generation to the next. There was one Creator, one purpose, one path of righteousness, one eternal message. Meanwhile, neighboring tribes increasingly recognized Ishaq as the successor to Ibrahim. People who once sought advice from the father now approached the son. Disputes over grazing lands, questions regarding wells, conflicts between shepherds, requests for mediation. Ishaq approached each matter with justice rather than favoritism. His judgments reflected wisdom rather than emotion. Fairness gradually strengthened the respect surrounding his household. Leadership founded upon justice always outlasts leadership founded upon fear. Another important aspect of Ishaq's character became widely admired. He remained remarkably peaceful. Unlike rulers eager for unnecessary conflict, Ishaq preferred reconciliation whenever justice allowed it. He understood that preserving peace often requires greater strength than winning battles. This gentle disposition never reflected weakness. Rather, it demonstrated complete confidence in Allah. A person who trusts Allah has no need to prove greatness through violence. The peaceful valleys of Canaan now entered a new chapter. The generation of Ibrahim had passed. The generation of Ishaq had fully begun. Yet Allah was already preparing another extraordinary servant whose destiny would transform sacred history once again. Among Ishaq's sons, one possessed a heart uniquely prepared for prophethood. His name was Yaqub. The quiet child who had listened attentively to his grandfather's stories and carefully watched his father's example would soon begin a journey unlike any other. Through him would arise 12 sons. Through those sons would emerge the children of Israel. Through that nation would come Yusuf, Musa, Harun, Dawud, Suleiman, Zachariah, Yahya, Isa, and countless righteous believers across the centuries. The covenant entrusted to Ibrahim had passed safely into the hands of Ishaq. Soon, it would continue through Yaqub. And with each passing generation, Allah's promise moved steadily toward the fulfillment he had decreed long before the foundations of the earth were laid. With the passing of Prophet Ibrahim, the responsibility of preserving Allah's covenant rested firmly upon the shoulders of Prophet Ishaq. The transition happened quietly. There was no coronation, no royal throne, and no public declaration made by earthly kings. The authority of a prophet never came from human governments. It came from Allah alone. Across the valleys of Canaan, people gradually realized that the righteous household of Ibrahim had not weakened after his death. Instead, it continued under the wise leadership of his son. Ishaq governed his family with justice, humility, and complete dependence upon Allah. His reputation spread from one settlement to another, not because he sought fame, but because honesty naturally attracts respect. The land surrounding Canaan remained politically unstable. Small kingdoms rose and fell with astonishing speed. Local rulers constantly competed over fertile farmland, trade routes, and access to water. Wells were among the most valuable possessions in the ancient world. Whoever controlled reliable water controlled agriculture, livestock, and survival itself. For nomadic shepherds like Ishaq, water meant life. Without it, entire flocks could perish within days. Without it, families would be forced to migrate. Without it, even prosperous tribes could collapse. This reality would soon become one of the greatest trials of Ishaq's life. The Quran tells us that a severe famine struck the region. This was not an ordinary shortage of food. Rain became scarce. Grasslands dried beneath the relentless sun. Fields produced poor harvests. Streams that once flowed steadily became weak. Livestock struggled to find pasture. Families began leaving their homes in search of more fertile lands. Throughout history, famine has often tested not only human endurance but also human faith. During prosperity, gratitude is easy. During hardship, true belief reveals itself. When the famine intensified, many people looked toward Egypt. For centuries, Egypt had depended upon the Nile River, whose annual flooding provided fertile soil even during difficult years. It became a natural destination for those escaping drought throughout the surrounding regions. Years earlier, Prophet Ibrahim himself had traveled toward Egypt during another period of famine. Now history appeared ready to repeat itself. As conditions worsened, Ishaq considered what should be done for his family and livestock. According to the Quran, Allah intervened directly. He instructed Ishaq not to leave the land. Instead, Allah commanded him to remain where he was. This command required extraordinary trust. Human reasoning pointed toward migration. Divine guidance instructed patience. Most people follow visible opportunities. Prophets follow revelation. The Quran records that Allah renewed his covenant with Ishaq, promising blessings for him and his descendants just as he had promised Ibrahim before him. This moment carried enormous significance. The covenant had officially passed from father to son. Allah confirmed that the promises given to Ibrahim remained fully alive. His descendants would multiply. The blessed land would remain connected to the covenant. Most importantly, the mission of Tawhid would continue through future generations. Classical scholars explain that this renewal was not because Allah had forgotten his promise. Rather, it strengthened Ishaq's heart during a difficult trial. Believers often receive reminders of Allah's promises precisely when worldly circumstances appear most discouraging. The famine eventually forced Ishaq to move temporarily within the region, settling near the territory of Gerar. This area lay under the rule of a local king known in biblical tradition as Abimelech. The Quran does not mention this ruler by name, and Muslim scholars generally avoid treating every biblical historical detail as certain unless confirmed by authentic Islamic sources. Nevertheless, both Islamic historical writings and ancient Near Eastern traditions describe Gerar as an important settlement located between Canaan and the coastal regions. Life there introduced new challenges. Competition over natural resources intensified. Neighboring shepherds competed for grazing land. Water became increasingly precious. Every newly discovered well represented survival for hundreds of animals and dozens of families. Soon, disagreements began emerging between Ishaq's shepherds and local tribes over access to water. At first glance, these conflicts appeared ordinary. But beneath the surface lay a remarkable lesson about the character of a prophet. Many tribal leaders would have responded with violence. A powerful household could easily have gathered armed men to seize control of valuable wells. Bloodshed over water was common throughout the ancient Near East. Yet Ishaq chose a different path. Whenever conflict erupted over a well, he often preferred to move elsewhere rather than allow unnecessary violence. His shepherds dug another well. If others claimed it, they moved again. They dug another. And another. Some observers misunderstood this patience as weakness. It was nothing of the sort. Ishaq understood something many rulers never learn. Peace purchased through patience often produces greater victory than land captured through war. Eventually, after several disputes, Allah guided Ishaq's people to a place where they dug a well that no one contested. For the first time in many months, they found stability. According to the historical narrative preserved in Genesis, Ishaq named that place Rehoboth, expressing gratitude that Allah had finally made room for them. Although the Quran does not record the name, the lesson remains entirely consistent with Islamic teaching. Those who trust Allah may experience repeated difficulties before receiving lasting relief. Patience rarely produces immediate results. But it never goes unrewarded. Classical mufassirin often point out that prophets demonstrate extraordinary restraint precisely because they understand the temporary nature of worldly possessions. Land belongs to Allah. Water belongs to Allah. Wealth belongs to Allah. Human beings merely act as temporary caretakers. This understanding frees believers from destructive greed. As Ishaq continued establishing his household, Allah blessed his efforts. His flocks multiplied. His herds increased. His servants became more numerous. Trade flourished. The surrounding people noticed that prosperity seemed to accompany everything Ishaq touched. Unlike those who gained wealth through oppression, Ishaq's success rested upon honesty, fairness, and divine blessing. Even neighboring rulers recognized this reality. Historical traditions describe local leaders becoming uneasy as Ishaq's influence steadily increased. Not because he sought political domination, but because righteous leadership naturally earns loyalty and respect. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Some kings relied upon fortified walls. Ishaq relied upon Allah. Some rulers trusted soldiers. Ishaq trusted truth. Some leaders inspired obedience through fear. Ishaq inspired respect through justice. This distinction explains why prophetic influence has survived thousands of years while countless ancient kingdoms disappeared into history. Every trial Ishaq faced strengthened rather than weakened his faith. Every hardship deepened his patience. Every blessing increased his gratitude. His children watched carefully. Young Yaqub especially observed how his father responded to conflict. He saw that true strength does not always mean defeating an opponent. Sometimes true strength means refusing to let hatred control the heart. These lessons would one day shape Yaqub's own remarkable life. The covenant continued growing quietly from one generation to the next. Empires remained unaware. Kings remained distracted. The world focused upon politics, commerce, and conquest. Meanwhile, inside one righteous household, Allah was preparing another prophet whose story would become one of the most extraordinary in all of sacred history. That young man was Yaqub, the beloved son of Prophet Ishaq. And the relationship between father and son would soon reveal another timeless example of faith, wisdom, and complete trust in the decree of Allah. As the years unfolded, the camp of Prophet Ishaq became known throughout Canaan as a place where justice could always be found. Travelers spoke of his generosity around evening campfires. Merchants who crossed the ancient trade routes told stories of a prophet whose word was more valuable than written contracts. Shepherds admired the fairness with which he settled disputes, while neighboring tribes respected him even when they did not share his faith. His growing influence did not come through conquest. It came through character. In every generation, Allah demonstrates that genuine leadership begins with integrity. A righteous person may never wear a crown, yet his influence can outlive the greatest kings. The household of Ishaq continued to prosper. His flocks multiplied until they covered wide stretches of pastureland. Hundreds of sheep grazed peacefully beneath the rolling hills, while herds of cattle and camels wandered across the valleys under the careful supervision of experienced shepherds. Servants managed storehouses filled with grain, olive oil, dried fruits, and wool gathered from countless seasons of work. Unlike many wealthy leaders of the ancient world, Ishaq never allowed prosperity to change his heart. The Quran repeatedly teaches that wealth itself is neither good nor evil. It is a test. Some people become grateful. Others become arrogant. Prophet Ishaq belonged to the first group. Every blessing increased his humility. Every successful harvest reminded him that Allah alone provides sustenance. Every healthy newborn animal reminded him that life belongs entirely to the Creator. He often gathered his family during the quiet evenings after the day's work had ended. The desert sky above Canaan shimmered with countless stars. Without the lights of modern cities, the heavens appeared breathtaking. Children naturally looked upward in wonder. Ishaq used these moments to teach them. He reminded Yaqub and Esau that the same stars had once inspired their grandfather Ibrahim to reflect upon the greatness of Allah. He explained that the stars themselves possessed no divine power. They neither controlled destiny nor accepted worship. Instead, they were signs pointing toward the one who created them. The one who placed every star in its place is the only one worthy of worship. These lessons remained deeply engraved within Yaqub's heart. From an early age, Yaqub displayed unusual spiritual sensitivity. He listened more than he spoke. He observed before acting. He reflected deeply upon everything his father taught. Classical Islamic scholars describe Yaqub as possessing exceptional patience even in childhood, a quality that would later define his entire life. Esau developed differently. He became physically powerful. His confidence grew through hunting and exploring the wilderness. He could spend days crossing forests and rocky mountains tracking wild animals. His courage impressed many people. His adventurous spirit earned admiration among neighboring tribes. Ishaq appreciated both sons. He understood that Allah creates people with different talents. One may excel through wisdom. Another through strength. Neither quality holds value unless it is used in obedience to Allah. A father does not love his children because they are identical. He loves them because Allah entrusted each one to his care. The Quran repeatedly presents prophets as compassionate fathers. They guided with wisdom rather than harshness. They corrected mistakes without destroying hope. They understood that true education requires patience. Ishaq followed this prophetic tradition. He taught through example long before giving instruction through words. Whenever guests arrived unexpectedly, they watched him personally welcome strangers with kindness. He never delegated generosity. Servants observed that he shared meals equally with visitors regardless of their social status. Rich merchants received no greater honor than poor travelers. Everyone ate together. Everyone received respect. Hospitality reflected faith. This noble character echoed throughout the region. Even tribes who continued worshipping idols admitted that the household of Ishaq possessed uncommon integrity. One elderly tribal leader reportedly remarked that disputes ended wherever Ishaq became involved. Although this statement comes through historical tradition rather than revelation, it reflects the reputation consistently associated with Allah's prophets. Justice naturally attracts trust. Around this time, Yaqub entered adulthood. His father increasingly involved him in important responsibilities. Together they inspected livestock. They supervised shepherds. They resolved disagreements between workers. They visited distant grazing lands. During these journeys, Ishaq continued teaching lessons impossible to learn inside tents alone. Standing beside ancient wells, he reminded Yaqub how Allah had protected them during years of drought. Walking across fertile valleys, he explained that prosperity disappears whenever people forget their Creator. Watching shepherds guide hundreds of sheep, he compared responsible leadership to caring for a flock. A shepherd thinks first about those under his care. This lesson would later become one of the defining principles of prophetic leadership. Leaders exist to serve, not to be served. Meanwhile, political tensions throughout Canaan continued increasing. Several nearby city-states strengthened their defenses. Trade routes shifted as rival kingdoms competed for influence. Foreign merchants introduced new religious practices and unfamiliar customs into the region. Idolatry became increasingly sophisticated. Instead of worshipping simple stone statues alone, many communities developed elaborate ceremonies, seasonal festivals, and temple rituals led by influential priests. False religion often becomes more convincing when wrapped in impressive ceremonies. But truth requires no decoration. Allah's message remained exactly as it had been since Adam. Worship Him alone. Speak the truth. Establish justice. Show mercy. Remain grateful. The simplicity of divine guidance stood in sharp contrast to the complicated superstitions surrounding Ishaq's household. Despite increasing cultural pressure, Ishaq never compromised. He did not soften Tawhid to gain popularity. He did not blend Allah's message with pagan traditions. He understood that truth loses its purity whenever mixed with falsehood. This unwavering commitment became another reason Allah honored him among the prophets. The Quran praises Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Yaqub together, describing them as servants chosen because of their sincerity and constant remembrance of the hereafter. Classical tafsir explains that these prophets lived with eternity in mind. They managed worldly affairs responsibly. They cared for families. They built prosperous communities. Yet their hearts remained attached to the life beyond this world. This balance distinguished them from ordinary rulers. Kings often sacrificed eternity for temporary glory. Prophets sacrificed temporary comfort for eternal success. As Ishaq grew older, he occasionally found himself remembering the extraordinary day his father had first told him about the angels. He remembered hearing how Allah had promised his birth before he existed. He reflected upon Sarah's joyful surprise. He remembered Ibrahim's endless gratitude. Looking at Yaqub, he now understood exactly how his own parents must have felt. Every generation experiences Allah's blessings differently. Parents pray for children. Children become parents. Then they watch their own children grow. The covenant continued through living hearts rather than written documents. Each generation passed faith to the next. Not merely through words, but through daily example. Without realizing it, Yaqub was absorbing every lesson. Every act of patience. Every decision based upon justice. Every prayer offered before dawn. Every guest welcomed with generosity. One day, those lessons would sustain him through trials greater than anyone in the family could imagine. For Allah was preparing Yaqub for a future filled with separation, sorrow, hope, and eventual reunion. But before that remarkable chapter could begin, Prophet Ishaq himself would face one of the most important responsibilities of his later years. The future of the covenant depended upon preparing the next prophet exactly as Ibrahim had once prepared him. And so, beneath the endless skies of Canaan, a father quietly began shaping the son through whom Allah's promise would continue for generations yet to come. The years moved quietly across the land of Canaan. Kingdoms continued to rise and disappear beyond the horizon, but within the household of Prophet Ishaq, another kind of history was being written. It was not the history of battles or political revolutions. It was the history of faith passed from one generation to the next. Prophets understood something that worldly rulers rarely considered. The future is not secured by stronger armies. It is secured by stronger hearts. Every sunrise became another opportunity for Ishaq to prepare his son, Yaqub, for the enormous responsibility that awaited him. Although Yaqub had reached adulthood, his education never truly ended. One evening, as the day's heat slowly faded, Ishaq invited his son to walk with him through the rolling hills surrounding their camp. The sheep grazed peacefully in the distance while shepherds prepared to return before nightfall. The air carried the scent of wild herbs growing among the rocky slopes. For a long time, neither father nor son spoke. Sometimes the greatest teachers begin with silence. Finally, Ishaq looked toward the vast horizon stretching beyond the hills. "My son," he said, "look carefully." Yaqub followed his father's gaze. He saw mountains. He saw valleys. He saw distant villages disappearing beneath the evening light. He saw the beauty of Allah's creation. Then Ishaq spoke again. "Everything your eyes can see belongs to Allah. People build cities. They claim ownership. They fight over borders. They believe their kingdoms will last forever. But every generation passes away. Only Allah remains." These words settled deeply into Yaqub's heart. Throughout history, prophets constantly reminded people that attachment to this world leads to disappointment. Every palace eventually becomes dust. Every empire eventually falls. Every wealthy ruler eventually enters the grave with empty hands. Only faith continues beyond death. The Quran repeatedly reminds believers that worldly life is temporary while the hereafter is everlasting. Ishaq wanted his son to understand this truth long before responsibility rested upon his shoulders. As they continued walking, they arrived beside one of the wells that had once been the center of fierce disputes. Years earlier, neighboring shepherds had argued over this very place. Some had demanded ownership. Others had threatened violence. Many expected Ishaq to fight. Instead, he chose patience. Standing beside the well, Yaqub remembered those difficult years. He had been young, but the memories remained clear. He looked toward his father. "Why did you leave the first wells instead of defending them?" The question was sincere. It reflected curiosity rather than criticism. Ishaq smiled gently. "Because not every battle deserves to be fought." He lowered a wooden bucket into the water. As it slowly filled, he continued speaking. "A person who wins an argument but loses his character has already been defeated. The strongest believer is not the one who defeats the most enemies. The strongest believer is the one who controls himself when anger demands revenge." This lesson would become one of the defining characteristics of Yaqub's own life. Many years later, when separated from his beloved son Yusuf, Yaqub would display exactly the same patience he had witnessed in his father. The education of prophets extended far beyond memorizing words. It shaped character. Back at the camp, life continued with remarkable simplicity. Women prepared bread using freshly ground grain. Children gathered firewood before darkness arrived. Servants milked goats and sheep. Experienced shepherds counted every animal before closing the temporary enclosures for the night. Although the household possessed considerable wealth by the standards of the ancient world, daily life remained humble. No one lived in luxury. No one behaved as though they were superior. Every member of the household understood that blessings require gratitude. The Quran consistently teaches that gratitude protects blessings while arrogance destroys them. Ishaq often reminded his family of this principle. Whenever the flocks increased, he praised Allah. Whenever rain arrived after months of drought, he praised Allah. Whenever travelers arrived safely after dangerous journeys, he praised Allah. His first response to every blessing was remembrance of the Creator. This habit influenced everyone around him. Children naturally imitate what they repeatedly observe. Yaqub saw gratitude practiced every day. He learned that success should never produce pride. Meanwhile, Esau continued spending much of his time hunting throughout the surrounding wilderness. He became famous among neighboring tribes for his remarkable skill. His arrows rarely missed. He knew every valley, every mountain path, and every watering place where wild animals gathered. Hunters admired him. Warriors respected him. His physical strength became widely recognized. Yet Ishaq continually reminded both sons that physical ability alone does not determine greatness. There are men stronger than lions, he would say. But they become prisoners of their own desires. There are men weaker than children. But their faith makes them stronger than kings. Such teachings reflected a central principle found throughout the Quran. True honor comes through righteousness. Not appearance. Not wealth. Not strength. Not ancestry. Only righteousness elevates a person before Allah. As Ishaq grew older, people increasingly traveled long distances simply to seek his advice. Some came with family disagreements. Others sought guidance regarding business partnerships. Nomadic tribes requested his mediation before conflicts escalated into violence. Although he possessed authority, Ishaq never judged hastily. He listened carefully. He questioned both sides equally. He refused favoritism. Justice requires patience. A hurried decision often becomes an unjust decision. Classical Islamic scholars frequently note that prophets never allowed personal relationships to influence their judgment. Even family members remained accountable before Allah. This commitment to justice strengthened public trust. The household of Ishaq gradually became known as a place where fairness could always be expected. Beyond Canaan, however, the spiritual condition of humanity continued deteriorating. Idolatry expanded. Temples grew larger. Priests accumulated wealth through superstition. Many people feared imaginary gods more than they feared the Creator who had given them life. The descendants of earlier righteous generations slowly forgot the message carried by Adam, Noah, and Ibrahim. This pattern repeated throughout history. When people abandon revelation, they create religion according to their own desires. Prophets were sent to restore, not invent, the truth. Ishaq understood this responsibility completely. His mission was not to create a new faith. His mission was to preserve the same message revealed to every prophet before him. There is only one God. There has always been only one God. Every prophet called humanity back to that eternal truth. As the years continued passing, Yaqub's wisdom matured alongside his faith. Those who observed him closely noticed remarkable similarities between grandfather, father, and son. Ibrahim had possessed unwavering certainty. Ishaq displayed gentle patience. Yaqub combined both qualities. The covenant was clearly continuing through another generation. Allah's promise remained alive. The elderly prophet often looked at his son with quiet gratitude. He knew that his own time in this world would not last forever. Just as Ibrahim had once prepared him, he was now preparing Yaqub. Every lesson mattered. Every conversation carried purpose. Because the day would soon come when Yaqub alone would bear the responsibility of leading the family chosen by Allah. And through Yaqub would come 12 sons whose descendants would transform the course of sacred history forever. As the decades passed, Prophet Ishaq became one of the most respected figures throughout the land of Canaan. His beard had turned white, much like his father Ibrahim's before him. The energetic young shepherd who once followed his father across hills and valleys had become an elderly prophet whose wisdom attracted people from every direction. Travelers no longer came merely to trade or seek shelter. Many arrived seeking guidance, justice, and prayers from a man whose life had become a living example of complete trust in Allah. Age brought physical weakness, but it also brought deeper wisdom. Every wrinkle upon Ishaq's face reflected years of patience. Every gray hair reminded him that Allah had fulfilled every promise made during his lifetime. He remembered the miraculous announcement before his birth. He remembered Sarah's joyful tears. He remembered the final days of Ibrahim. He remembered the years of famine and the disputes over wells. Looking back across his life, one truth became unmistakably clear. Allah had never abandoned him. Not once. Sometimes Allah answered immediately. Sometimes he delayed. Sometimes he tested. Sometimes he blessed. But every decree had ultimately been perfect. This realization filled Ishaq's heart with gratitude rather than regret. The Quran repeatedly teaches that believers should reflect upon Allah's blessings throughout their lives. Reflection strengthens faith because it reveals how divine wisdom has quietly guided every stage of a person's journey. As Ishaq entered old age, his eyesight gradually weakened. According to historical reports found in Genesis, he eventually became nearly blind. The Quran neither confirms nor denies this detail, and classical Muslim scholars generally treat it as part of the historical narrative without considering it an established point of Islamic belief. What remains certain is that advancing age reduced his physical strength while leaving his spiritual insight stronger than ever. Meanwhile, Yaqub had become a mature man known for wisdom, humility, and devotion. Every day, he demonstrated the lessons learned from his father. He treated workers fairly. He honored guests generously. He remained patient during hardship. He worshipped Allah sincerely. The resemblance between father and son extended far beyond appearance. Their hearts shared the same devotion to Tawhid. Their lives reflected the same commitment to justice. Their greatest desire remained the pleasure of Allah. Ishaq, too, had established himself as a respected figure among neighboring tribes. His courage and hunting skills continued earning admiration. He spent much of his life outdoors, crossing mountains and forests with remarkable confidence. Although the brothers possessed different personalities, Ishaq continued loving both of them as a father should. Islam consistently teaches parents to maintain justice and compassion toward all children. Favoritism creates resentment. Fairness creates unity. Classical scholars frequently emphasize this principle using numerous authentic narrations from the life of Prophet Muhammad. One afternoon, while sitting outside his tent, Ishaq watched children playing among the grazing animals. The scene reminded him of his own childhood. He could almost hear Ibrahim's voice calling him for prayer. He remembered walking beside his father through these same valleys. The memories felt as vivid as yesterday. Time passes quickly. Generations replace one another with astonishing speed. Children become parents. Parents become grandparents. Then, one day, they return to Allah. This awareness encouraged Ishaq to spend even more time teaching the younger members of his household. He knew that knowledge disappears unless transmitted carefully. One evening, he gathered his family beneath the brilliant night sky. Thousands of stars illuminated the heavens. The cool desert breeze moved gently through the camp. Everyone sat quietly as the elderly prophet began speaking. "My father taught me something I have never forgotten." He paused. When people forget Allah during times of comfort, they often remember him only after hardship arrives. The family listened attentively. So remember Allah before hardship comes. Be grateful before blessings disappear. Repent before death approaches. Help others before you need their help. These simple words carried profound wisdom. Throughout Islamic history, scholars have noted that prophets rarely used complicated language. They spoke clearly. They spoke sincerely. Their words reached the heart because they first came from the heart. As Ishaq continued teaching, he reminded his family about the covenant Allah had established with Ibrahim. This promise was never about wealth. It was never about becoming rulers. It was never about worldly greatness. It was about carrying guidance. He looked toward Yaqub. Never allow this responsibility to become a source of pride. The more Allah honors a servant, the more humble that servant should become. This lesson would later define Yaqub's own character throughout the enormous trials awaiting him. Beyond the camp, the surrounding civilizations continued pursuing worldly ambitions. Egypt expanded its influence. Mesopotamian kingdoms competed for dominance. City-states strengthened defensive walls. Priests accumulated wealth. Merchants crossed continents seeking profit. Most people measured success by power. The prophets measured success by obedience. This difference separated divine civilization from worldly civilization. One builds monuments. The other builds souls. One seeks temporary glory. The other seeks eternal reward. The Quran repeatedly praises Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Yaqub together because each generation faithfully preserved this perspective. They lived in the world without becoming slaves to it. As the years continued, Ishaq increasingly devoted long hours to worship. Before dawn, he stood in prayer while the rest of the camp remained asleep. His whispered supplications filled the silent darkness. He prayed for forgiveness. He prayed for his descendants. He prayed that future generations would remain firm upon Tawhid. He understood that the greatest danger facing any nation is not military defeat. It is spiritual corruption. A society may survive poverty. It may recover from natural disasters. It may rebuild after war. But once faith disappears, rebuilding becomes far more difficult. This concern remained constantly within the hearts of every prophet. One morning, after completing prayer, Ishaq watched the first rays of sunlight spread across the hills of Canaan. The beauty before him reminded him of Allah's countless signs throughout creation. Every sunrise testified to divine mercy. Every season demonstrated perfect balance. Every newborn lamb reminded him that life continually renews itself according to Allah's command. The universe itself remained one enormous reminder of the Creator. This was precisely why the Quran repeatedly invites believers to reflect upon nature. Creation points toward its Creator. It always has. It always will. As Ishaq's earthly journey gradually approached its final chapter, he felt neither fear nor regret. He had witnessed Allah's promises fulfilled. He had preserved his father's message. He had raised a righteous son who would continue the covenant. His mission had been completed faithfully. Soon, the responsibility for guiding the chosen family would pass completely into the hands of Prophet Yaqub. But before that transition occurred, one final chapter remained in the remarkable life of Prophet Ishaq. It would not be marked by conquest or miracles witnessed by nations. Instead, it would reveal the quiet dignity of a prophet preparing to meet his Lord after a lifetime devoted entirely to his worship. The final chapter of a prophet's life is never measured by worldly achievements. Kings spend their last years protecting their thrones. Conquerors worry about preserving their empires. Merchants count their wealth. Warriors remember their victories. But prophets prepare for something infinitely greater. They prepare to return to the Lord they spent their entire lives worshipping. As Prophet Ishaq entered the final stage of his earthly journey, the pace of his life became slower. The once tireless shepherd who had walked countless miles across the hills of Canaan now relied more upon the younger members of his household to oversee the daily affairs of the camp. Yaqub assumed greater responsibility with each passing season, while trusted servants managed the growing flocks under his direction. The elderly prophet welcomed this transition. He had never desired authority for its own sake. Leadership was always a trust. Every trust eventually returns to another generation. This was the way Allah had established life since the creation of Adam. The Quran repeatedly reminds humanity that people succeed one another upon the earth. One generation arrives while another departs. Nations rise, flourish, weaken, and disappear. Yet Allah remains unchanged. Watching his grandchildren playing outside the tents, Ishaq often reflected upon this divine pattern. He remembered himself as a child sitting beside Sarah. He remembered Ibrahim lifting him into his arms. He remembered learning his first prayers. Now those memories belonged to another lifetime. The children laughing before him knew only the elderly prophet whose gentle smile welcomed them every morning. Time transforms every generation. Only Allah exists beyond time. As his physical strength declined, Ishaq devoted even more hours to worship. Long before dawn, while the stars still filled the heavens above Canaan, he quietly rose from his bed. The camp remained silent. Only the distant sounds of grazing animals disturbed the stillness. Standing alone before his Lord, Ishaq praised Allah for every blessing he had received. He thanked Allah for granting him life through miracle. He thanked Allah for Ibrahim and Sarah. He thanked Allah for Rebekah. He thanked Allah for Yaqub and Esau. He thanked Allah for every trial that had strengthened his faith. Most of all, he thanked Allah for allowing him to remain steadfast upon Tawhid until old age. Classical Islamic scholars frequently explain that gratitude increases as faith matures. Young believers often ask Allah for blessings. The righteous elderly spend more time thanking him for blessings already received. This became one of Ishaq's greatest characteristics during his final years. Gratitude replaced every complaint. Contentment replaced every worldly ambition. His greatest desire became meeting Allah with a pure heart. The Quran praises Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Yaqub as servants whom Allah purified through sincere remembrance of the hereafter. This description reveals an important reality. The prophets never forgot that death was approaching. Rather than fearing it, they prepared for it. Preparation did not mean abandoning worldly responsibilities. It meant fulfilling them with sincerity. Even in old age, Ishaq continued advising those who came seeking guidance. A young shepherd once asked him what quality mattered most in life. The elderly prophet smiled before answering. If your heart is connected to Allah, everything else eventually finds its proper place. Another traveler asked how a person could remain patient during hardship. Ishaq pointed toward a nearby olive tree. Look at that tree. It grows slowly. It survives heat. It survives cold. It survives drought. Yet every season, it continues producing fruit. The believer should be like that. Although these conversations are presented as literary reconstructions inspired by the prophetic character rather than verbatim historical reports, they reflect principles consistently taught throughout the Quran and authentic Sunnah. The household surrounding Ishaq increasingly recognized that his earthly journey was nearing its completion. Yaqub spent long hours beside his father. He asked questions. He listened carefully. Sometimes they simply sat together without speaking. Silence itself became a form of teaching. A son does not always learn through words. He learns by watching how his father faces the end of life. Ishaq displayed remarkable peace. He showed no panic. No bitterness. No regret. Only trust. He knew that every soul returns to its Creator. This certainty removed fear from his heart. Islam teaches that death is not the end. It is the beginning of another existence. For prophets, it marks the completion of their earthly mission and the beginning of eternal reward with Allah. Outside the camp, life continued as it always had. Caravans crossed ancient trade routes. Children were born. Harvests came and went. Kings argued over territory. Merchants negotiated prices. The world rarely pauses when great people leave it. History continues moving. Yet heaven records every righteous soul. As Ishaq's final days approached, he called Yaqub close. The Quran does not preserve a detailed farewell conversation between them. However, it repeatedly emphasizes the importance of fathers reminding their families to worship Allah alone. This had been Ibrahim's greatest advice. Now it remained Ishaq's greatest concern. Not wealth. Not inheritance. Not property. Faith. The covenant could survive poverty. It could survive famine. It could survive migration. It could not survive abandoning Tawhid. That truth mattered more than anything else. Yaqub understood perfectly. He had spent his entire life watching his father's example. The lessons no longer required explanation. They had become part of his character. The patience shown during disputes over wells. The gratitude expressed after every blessing. The justice demonstrated toward servants and strangers alike. The unwavering worship offered regardless of hardship. All of it now lived within Yaqub himself. The covenant was ready to continue. Islamic historical tradition generally holds that Prophet Ishaq lived to an advanced age, with many reports placing his lifespan at around 180 years, though the Quran does not specify his exact age and Muslim scholars do not treat these chronological reports as matters of creed. What remains beyond doubt is that Allah blessed him with a long life filled with worship, family, and prophetic service. When the moment decreed by Allah finally arrived, Prophet Ishaq returned to his Creator. The miraculous child promised by angels. The beloved son of Ibrahim and Sarah. The righteous husband of Rebekah. The father of Yaqub. The grandfather of the future tribes of Israel. The prophet chosen by Allah. Completed his mission upon the earth. His passing marked the end of one chapter in sacred history. But it did not end the covenant. The light of guidance continued shining through Yaqub. From Yaqub would come Yusuf, whose story would become one of the greatest narratives of patience and forgiveness. Generations later would come Musa, who confronted Pharaoh. Then Harun. Then Dawood. Then Suleiman. Then Zachariah. Then Yahya. Then Isa, the Messiah. And centuries after them, from the descendants of Ishaq's brother Ismail, Allah would send the final messenger, Muhammad, completing the chain of prophethood for all humanity. The life of Prophet Ishaq may appear quieter than the lives of some other prophets. He did not part the sea. He did not build an ark. He did not confront a tyrant like Pharaoh. Yet his importance cannot be measured by dramatic events. His greatness lay in preserving the covenant. He faithfully carried the torch of Tawhid from Ibrahim to Yaqub. Without that faithful stewardship, the history of divine revelation would have unfolded very differently. Sometimes the greatest heroes are not those who begin a mission. They are those who preserve it with unwavering faith until the next generation is ready to carry it forward. And that is exactly what Prophet Ishaq, peace be upon him, accomplished. Although Prophet Ishaq's earthly life had come to an end, his influence was only beginning to spread across history. The death of a prophet never marks the end of his mission. Instead, it marks the beginning of the legacy he leaves behind. Unlike kings whose kingdoms often collapse after their deaths, the message carried by Allah's prophets continues through faith, righteous descendants, and divine revelation. The Quran repeatedly presents Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Yaqub together as one blessed family. Allah says, "And we bestowed upon him Ishaq and Yaqub, each of whom we guided. And now we guided before, and among his descendants were Dawood, Suleiman, Ayyub, Yusuf, Musa, Harun. Thus do we reward those who excel in doing good." This remarkable verse reveals something extraordinary. Allah himself connects Ishaq directly to a chain of prophets that stretches across centuries. From Ishaq came Yaqub. From Yaqub came Yusuf. Generations later came Musa and Harun. Then Dawood. Then Suleiman. Then Zachariah. Then Yahya. Then Isa, son of Maryam. Every one of these prophets carried exactly the same message. Worship Allah alone. The methods differed according to the needs of their people. The laws differed in certain details. But the foundation never changed. Islam teaches that there has always been only one true religion, complete submission to Allah. The prophets did not invent different religions. They renewed the same eternal truth whenever humanity drifted away from it. Because of this, Ishaq occupies a unique position in sacred history. He served as the bridge between Ibrahim and the long succession of Israelite prophets. Without him, that sacred chain would not exist. The Quran repeatedly refers to him as one of Allah's chosen servants. In Surah As-Safat, Allah declares, "And we gave him the good news of Ishaq, a prophet from among the righteous." Notice something remarkable. Allah announced Ishaq's prophethood before he was even born. Very few people in human history received such an honor. His future was known by Allah before his first breath. His mission was already written. His descendants had already been chosen. His role in history had already been established. This illustrates one of the central beliefs of Islam. Nothing surprises Allah. Past, present, and future are all known to him perfectly. Classical scholars such as Ibn Kathir explain that the announcement of Ishaq's future prophethood demonstrated Allah's complete knowledge and wisdom. The miracle was never simply that an elderly couple received a son. The greater miracle was that this son would become a prophet whose descendants would illuminate history for thousands of years. Another important lesson emerges from Ishaq's story. He never sought attention. Unlike some prophets whose missions included dramatic public miracles witnessed by entire nations, Ishaq's life unfolded with quiet consistency. His greatest miracles were not spectacular events. They were faithful obedience, patient endurance, steadfast worship, righteous leadership. Modern societies often admire people because they become famous. Allah honors people because they remain sincere. These two standards are completely different. Many famous individuals disappear from memory within a few generations. Prophets remain remembered because Allah Himself preserves their honor. The life of Ishaq also demonstrates the importance of family. Every prophet understood that reforming society begins by reforming the home. Ibrahim raised Ishaq. Ishaq raised Yaqub. Yaqub raised 12 sons. Among those sons came Yusuf, whose story continues inspiring believers around the world. One righteous generation influences the next. Then the next. Then the next. Faith multiplies through families devoted to Allah. The Quran repeatedly encourages believers to pray not only for themselves but also for their children and future generations. The prophets consistently practiced this principle. They never viewed success as something limited to their own lifetime. Instead, they invested in people who would continue the mission after them. This explains why Ishaq devoted so much attention to teaching Yaqub. He understood that leadership is temporary. Faith must continue. Islamic scholars frequently describe the household of Ibrahim as the greatest family ever blessed with prophethood. Within only a few generations appeared an astonishing number of Allah's chosen messengers. Ibrahim, Ismail, Ishaq, Yaqub, Yusuf, and many others after them. Yet despite receiving extraordinary honor, this family remained remarkably humble. Their greatness came through service. Not privilege. Not worldly status. Not political authority. This distinction remains essential. Allah never chooses prophets because of noble ancestry alone. He chooses them because of righteousness. Another fascinating aspect of Ishaq's legacy appears when examining the history of civilizations. Many ancient kingdoms that existed during his lifetime have disappeared completely. The Amorites faded. The Hittites declined. the Canaanite city-states eventually vanished. Empires that once seemed invincible became ruins buried beneath centuries of dust. Archaeologists now excavate their palaces. Historians reconstruct their forgotten languages. Tourists walk through their abandoned cities. Yet the name of Ishaq continues to be spoken every day by billions of believers. This fulfills another timeless principle. Worldly power eventually disappears. Faith endures. The Quran repeatedly invites believers to reflect upon the remains of earlier civilizations. Where are the kings who believed themselves immortal? Where are the tyrants who challenged Allah? Where are the rulers whose armies once terrified entire nations? Their wealth remains behind. Their monuments crumble. Their names fade. But the servants of Allah continue receiving honor long after their earthly lives end. Prophet Ishaq stands among those honored servants. His story also reminds believers that greatness is not measured by how many miracles people witness. Some prophets spent decades calling only a small number of believers. Others confronted mighty kings. Others endured exile. Others performed astonishing miracles. Each fulfilled the mission Allah assigned. Success belongs to obedience. Not popularity. Not numbers. Not public recognition. The Prophet Muhammad later emphasized this reality through his own teachings. He explained that some prophets would arrive on the Day of Judgment followed by only a handful of believers. Others would have even fewer. Their apparent worldly results never diminished their honor before Allah. Likewise, Ishaq fulfilled exactly what Allah commanded. Nothing more was required. Nothing less. His life teaches modern believers an important lesson. You do not need extraordinary fame to leave an extraordinary legacy. Raise righteous children. Remain honest. Practice patience. Establish justice. Worship Allah sincerely. These seemingly ordinary acts can influence generations long after a person's death. That is precisely what happened through Ishaq. His earthly life appeared peaceful compared to many other prophets. Yet the generations that followed transformed world history. Sometimes the quietest lives produce the loudest echoes across time. And the gentle prophet who once walked silently among the hills of Canaan became one of the greatest links in the sacred chain of revelation that ultimately guided billions of human beings toward the worship of the one true Creator. The story of Prophet Ishaq, peace be upon him, extends far beyond the boundaries of the Quran alone. For more than 3,000 years, his name has appeared in the sacred traditions of three major Abrahamic faiths. Muslims know him as Prophet Ishaq, a righteous messenger of Allah and the son of Prophet Ibrahim. Jews know him as Yitzhak, one of the three great patriarchs of Israel. Christians honor him as Isaac, a central figure in the Old Testament and an important ancestor in the genealogy leading to Jesus. Although these traditions share many historical foundations, they also differ in important ways. Understanding these similarities and differences allows us to appreciate both the common heritage and the unique perspective preserved by Islam. The Quran speaks about Ishaq with dignity and remarkable clarity. Unlike many historical accounts that focus extensively on personal drama, the Quran emphasizes the spiritual significance of his life. Every mention of Ishaq highlights one central reality. He was chosen by Allah. He was righteous. He was blessed. He was a prophet. His descendants became carriers of divine revelation. The Quran never portrays Ishaq as competing with his brother Ismail for Allah's love or favor. Instead, both brothers receive extraordinary honor. Allah praises both. Allah blesses both. Allah appoints both as prophets. This balance forms one of the defining characteristics of the Islamic narrative. Islam rejects the idea that one righteous prophet must diminish another. Every prophet occupies a unique position within Allah's plan. The Quran repeatedly reminds believers not to make divisions between Allah's messengers. All deserve respect. All carried divine guidance. All called humanity toward Tawhid. When we turn to the book of Genesis in the Tanakh and the Old Testament, we discover many historical details not mentioned in the Quran. These include descriptions of Ishaq's daily life, his interactions with neighboring rulers, the journeys of his servants, and extensive genealogical records. Muslim scholars have traditionally approached these accounts with careful balance. The Prophet Muhammad explained that reports inherited from the people of the book should neither be automatically accepted nor automatically rejected unless they clearly agree or conflict with authentic Islamic revelation. This principle protected Islamic scholarship from two extremes: blind acceptance, blind rejection. Instead, scholars carefully evaluated historical reports according to the guidance of the Quran and authentic Sunnah. Classical scholars such as Ibn Kathir frequently quoted historical material originating from earlier scriptures. However, he consistently reminded readers that ultimate certainty belongs only to authentic revelation from Allah. This scholarly honesty remains one of the strengths of classical Islamic scholarship. One of the most significant differences between Islamic and biblical narratives concerns the identity of the son whom Prophet Ibrahim was commanded to sacrifice. The Quran tells the story without explicitly naming the son. However, the overwhelming majority of classical Muslim scholars, based on the sequence of Quranic verses and authentic historical understanding, concluded that the son was Prophet Ismail. After describing that event, the Quran then announces the glad tidings of Ishaq's birth. The sequence strongly indicates that the sacrifice occurred before Ishaq was born. The book of Genesis, however, explicitly identifies Isaac as the son presented for sacrifice. This difference has remained one of the major distinctions between Islamic and biblical tradition. Despite this disagreement, both traditions preserve the central lesson: complete submission to the command of God. Another important comparison concerns the covenant. In Judaism, Isaac becomes the direct heir to God's covenant with Abraham, and from Isaac comes Jacob, later called Israel. The Jewish people traced their national ancestry through this lineage. Christianity accepts this historical lineage while interpreting many of its theological implications differently. Islam agrees that many prophets descended from Ishaq through Yaqub. However, Islam also emphasizes that Allah blessed Ismail with prophethood and established another honored lineage through him. Centuries later, from the descendants of Ismail, Allah sent the final messenger, Muhammad. Thus, Islam views both branches of Ibrahim's family as blessed, each fulfilling different roles within Allah's universal plan. Neither branch cancels the other. Together, they demonstrate Allah's wisdom across history. The Quran repeatedly rejects any claim that ancestry alone guarantees salvation. This principle distinguishes Islamic teaching from ethnic or tribal understandings of divine favor. Allah says that the most honored people are those with the greatest righteousness, not those with the greatest ancestry. Even being born into the family of prophets never guaranteed success. Faith remained the true standard. This lesson appears repeatedly throughout sacred history. The son of Prophet Noah rejected guidance. The father of Prophet Ibrahim rejected guidance. Many relatives of prophets refused belief despite witnessing extraordinary signs. Conversely, many believers with no prophetic ancestry achieved immense honor through sincere faith. The message remains timeless. Character matters more than bloodline. The Bible contains extended narratives describing interactions between Ishaq and neighboring rulers, especially concerning wells, treaties, and family relationships. Although the Quran does not repeat these details, it does not contradict the general historical setting in which Ishaq lived. Muslim historians often mention these events while distinguishing between historical tradition and revealed certainty. This careful distinction reflects intellectual integrity. Not every ancient report carries the same level of authenticity. Islam teaches believers to separate established revelation from historical possibility. This approach preserves both faith and scholarship. Another remarkable point of agreement across all three Abrahamic traditions concerns Ishaq's character. Whether one reads the Quran, classical tafsir, Jewish tradition, or much of the biblical narrative, Ishaq consistently appears as a peaceful, patient, and deeply faithful individual. He is not remembered primarily as a warrior. He is remembered as a man of covenant. A man of worship. A man of quiet strength. His life demonstrates that greatness does not always appear dramatic. Some of history's most influential people transformed the world without commanding armies or ruling empires. Their influence flowed from righteousness rather than power. Islamic scholars frequently emphasize this point. The greatest legacy of Ishaq was not political authority. It was spiritual continuity. He preserved the covenant entrusted by Allah. He raised Yaqub. He maintained Tawhid. He passed revelation safely to the next generation. Without that faithful preservation, the history of prophethood would have unfolded very differently. The Quran also presents an important theological correction regarding the prophets themselves. Islam teaches that Allah's prophets were protected from major sins that would compromise their mission. Some biblical passages describe prophets in ways that Muslim scholars reject as inconsistent with prophetic dignity. For this reason, classical Islamic scholarship accepts only those historical reports that do not conflict with the honor, integrity, and righteousness consistently affirmed by the Quran. This principle safeguards the high status Allah granted His messengers. Prophets were human. They experienced hunger. They experienced grief. They experienced fatigue. They experienced trials. But they remain the finest examples of moral excellence chosen to guide humanity. When all the evidence is examined together, one remarkable conclusion becomes clear. Despite differences in historical detail, millions of Muslims, Jews, and Christians have remembered the name of Ishaq for thousands of years. Empires that surrounded him disappeared. Languages changed. Borders shifted. Civilizations rose and fell. Yet the memory of the quiet prophet from Canaan endured. His life became a bridge connecting generations, scriptures, and civilizations. And through that bridge, the light first entrusted to Ibrahim continued illuminating the world, generation after generation, until the final revelation descended upon Prophet Muhammad, completing the divine message that all prophets, including Ishaq, had faithfully proclaimed. There is no deity worthy of worship except Allah. From the earliest centuries of Islam, scholars devoted immense effort to understanding every verse of the Quran that mentions Prophet Ishaq, Isaac, peace be upon him. While the Quran speaks about some prophets in great narrative detail, such as Nuh, Musa, Yusuf, and Ibrahim, the story of Ishaq is presented differently. His life is spread across multiple surahs, with each passage highlighting a specific lesson rather than telling a continuous chronological story. For the classical scholars, this was not an omission. It was a deliberate choice by Allah. The Quran is not merely a history book. It is a book of guidance. Every verse appears exactly where Allah intended, emphasizing the lesson most needed rather than following a strict historical sequence. Ibn Kathir explains that the repeated mention of Ishaq throughout the Quran demonstrates his extraordinary status among the prophets. Allah consistently pairs his name with Ibrahim and Yaqub, showing that revelation continued through one righteous generation after another. According to Ibn Kathir, this continuity proves that Allah's covenant was never based upon worldly inheritance alone. It was a covenant of faith, obedience, and righteousness. He also points out that Allah announced Ishaq's prophethood before his birth, an honor granted to very few people in history. This announcement showed that Allah's knowledge encompasses every generation before it even exists. Al-Tabari approaches the story from another perspective. Known as one of Islam's greatest historians and Quranic commentators, Al-Tabari carefully gathered reports from the earliest generations of Muslims. He emphasized that the miraculous birth of Ishaq demonstrated Allah's unlimited power over creation. Human beings see obstacles. Allah sees His decree. Old age presented no difficulty for the Creator. Barrenness presented no obstacle. Time itself could not delay what Allah had already written. Al-Tabari repeatedly reminds readers that believers should never judge Allah's ability according to human limitations. If Allah created Adam without parents, if He created Hawa from Adam, if He later created Isa without a father, then creating Ishaq from elderly parents belongs to the same divine power. For Al-Tabari, the miracle of Ishaq's birth was never merely biological. It was theological. It proved that Allah controls every law governing the universe. Imam al-Qurtubi focuses extensively on the spiritual lessons contained within Ishaq's story. One of his central observations concerns patience. He explains that Ibrahim and Sarah waited decades before receiving the child Allah had promised. Modern people often expect immediate answers to every prayer. The prophets teach something different. Delay does not mean rejection. Sometimes Allah delays a blessing because the appointed time has not yet arrived. Sometimes He delays because the waiting itself strengthens faith. Sometimes He delays because a greater wisdom remains hidden from human understanding. Al-Qurtubi repeatedly returns to this principle. A believer judges Allah by his wisdom, not by the calendar. Another scholar, al-Baghawi, highlights the honor Allah bestowed upon the household of Ibrahim. He notes that very few families in human history have received such extraordinary blessings. Within only a few generations appeared multiple prophets chosen directly by Allah. Ibrahim, Ismail, Ishaq, Yaqub, Yusuf, and many prophets who followed afterward. According to al-Baghawi, this honor came not because of family status but because each generation remained devoted to Tawhid. Faith preserved the blessing, not ancestry alone. Imam Fakhr al-Din al-Razi explores the philosophical dimensions of Ishaq's story. He asks an important question. Why did Allah repeatedly mention Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Yaqub together? His answer reveals remarkable depth. Because guidance is strongest when transmitted through living examples rather than isolated individuals. One righteous believer influences a family. A righteous family influences a nation. A righteous nation influences history. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout Revelation. Allah changes societies by first transforming individuals. Those individuals then transform households. Households eventually transform civilizations. For al-Razi, the family of Ibrahim represents the greatest historical example of this principle. Ibn Ashur, writing many centuries later, examines the linguistic beauty of the Quranic verses concerning Ishaq. He observes that Allah repeatedly describes Ishaq using words associated with blessing, righteousness, and guidance. None of these descriptions focus upon political authority. None celebrate military achievements. Instead, Allah honors moral excellence. This distinction remains deeply significant. Throughout history, people often celebrate conquerors. Allah celebrates righteousness. The Quran's priorities differ completely from worldly standards. Another fascinating observation made by classical scholars concerns the emotional balance displayed throughout Ishaq's life. Unlike many historical figures remembered for dramatic victories or devastating defeats, Ishaq's life appears remarkably peaceful. Some readers mistakenly assume this means his story is less important. The scholars strongly reject that conclusion. Ibn Kathir explains that preserving truth peacefully may require just as much greatness as defending it during persecution. Every prophet fulfilled a different mission. Nuh endured rejection. Musa confronted Pharaoh. Yusuf survived betrayal. Sulayman ruled a kingdom. Ishaq preserved the covenant. Different missions. Equal obedience. Equal honor before Allah. Classical tafsir also emphasizes another important lesson. Every blessing received by Ishaq pointed back toward Allah rather than toward himself. His miraculous birth reminded people of Allah's power. His prophethood reminded people of Allah's guidance. His descendants reminded people of Allah's covenant. His peaceful character reminded people of Allah's mercy. Nothing in his life encouraged personal glorification. Everything directed attention toward the Creator. This reflects the defining characteristic of every prophet. They never invited people to worship themselves. They invited humanity toward Allah alone. One question frequently discussed by the classical scholars concerns why the Quran contains fewer narrative details about Ishaq compared with prophets like Musa or Yusuf. Their answer is profound. The Quran provides exactly as much history as guidance requires. Some prophets receive lengthy narratives because their experiences contain lessons especially relevant to later generations. Others receive shorter accounts because their primary significance lies within the continuation of revelation rather than dramatic public events. Ishaq belongs to this second category. His quiet life became the bridge through which countless later prophets emerged. Without the bridge, the chain breaks. His apparent simplicity hides extraordinary importance. The scholars therefore caution believers against measuring greatness by the length of a narrative. Allah alone determines true rank. The Prophet Muhammad also mentioned Ishaq with honor in authentic narrations, referring to the noble lineage of the prophets and emphasizing their shared mission of guiding humanity to worship the one God. Islam teaches that believers love and respect every prophet without discrimination. Rejecting one messenger means rejecting the message itself. Believing in all of them completes faith. When the classical commentaries are read together, a beautiful portrait emerges. Ishaq was the miracle granted to elderly parents. The prophet chosen before birth. The patient servant who preserved his father's covenant. The righteous father who prepared Yaqub. The quiet guardian of Tawhid. The link connecting Ibrahim to generations of prophets yet unborn. His life reminds believers that history is not always shaped by the loudest voices or the greatest armies. Sometimes history changes because one faithful servant quietly obeys Allah for an entire lifetime. And through that quiet obedience, entire civilizations inherit the light of divine guidance. One of the greatest ways to understand the life of Prophet Ishaq, peace be upon him, is to study every place where Allah mentions him in the Quran. Unlike many prophets whose stories appear mainly in one or two chapters, Ishaq is mentioned across numerous surahs. Each verse adds another piece to the larger picture, revealing not merely the events of his life but the qualities that made him one of Allah's chosen messengers. When these verses are brought together, they form a remarkable portrait of a prophet whose entire existence reflected Allah's mercy, wisdom, and covenant. The first mention connected to Ishaq appears during one of the most famous moments in the history of revelation. Prophet Ibrahim had welcomed unknown travelers into his tent with extraordinary generosity. He did not know they were angels. As was his lifelong habit, he immediately prepared food for his guests without asking who they were or what they wanted. Only after noticing that they did not eat did he begin to realize that these visitors were unlike ordinary human beings. The angels then delivered astonishing news. Allah had sent them first to announce the destruction of the people of Lut because of their corruption. But before leaving, they carried another message. A message that would transform history forever. Allah says in Surah Hud, 11:71-73, that Sarah, the wife of Ibrahim, laughed when she heard the announcement. Then the angels gave her glad tidings of Ishaq, and after Ishaq, Yaqub. Sarah expressed understandable surprise. She was elderly. Her husband was elderly. From every human perspective, having a child was impossible. The angels answered with words that continue inspiring believers until today. Do you wonder at the decree of Allah? The mercy and blessings of Allah are upon you, O people of the household. Classical scholars explain that this conversation demonstrates one of the central themes of Islamic belief. Human beings calculate according to physical possibility. Allah acts according to absolute power. Nothing limits him. The announcement itself contained two miracles. Not only would Sarah give birth to Ishaq, she was also told that she would live long enough to see her grandson Yaqub. Imagine the certainty contained within that promise. Before Ishaq was even born, Allah had already informed them about the next generation. The future belonged entirely to him. Another important reference appears in Surah As-Safat, 37:112-113. After describing Ibrahim's supreme test of sacrifice and complete submission to Allah, the Quran says, "And we gave him glad tidings of Ishaq, a prophet from among the righteous. And we blessed him in Ishaq." Notice the wording carefully. Allah does not merely promise a child. He promises a prophet. Even before birth, Ishaq's future mission had already been declared. Very few human beings receive such an announcement. The scholars explain that this verse also demonstrates Allah's perfect knowledge. Human beings discover the future one day at a time. Allah knows every generation before creation itself. The Quran then says, "Among their descendants are those who do good and those who clearly wrong themselves." This verse contains profound wisdom. Being born into the family of a prophet does not automatically guarantee righteousness. Every individual remains responsible before Allah. Some descendants became righteous. Others chose different paths. Faith can never be inherited like property. It must be chosen. This principle remains one of the defining teachings of Islam. In Surah Al-Ankabut, 29:27, Allah says, "And we granted him Ishaq and Yaqub, and we placed among his descendants prophethood and the scripture." This verse summarizes centuries of sacred history in only a few words. Through Ishaq came Yaqub. Through Yaqub came the children of Israel. Among them appeared Yusuf. Then Musa, Harun, Dawood, Suleiman, Ayyub, Yunus, Zachariah, Yahya, Isa. Countless prophets emerged from the family line Allah established through Ishaq. The verse also mentions the scripture. This includes the divine revelations granted across successive generations. The Torah, the Zabur, the Injil. Each revelation came according to Allah's wisdom. Each renewed the same essential message. Worship Allah alone. In Surah Al-An'am, 6 hours 84 minutes, Allah declares, "And we gave him Ishaq and Yaqub. Each we guided." The wording appears simple. Yet every word carries enormous significance. Allah himself testifies that Ishaq received guidance directly from him. No greater honor exists. The verse continues by listing numerous prophets descended through this blessed lineage. The Quran intentionally connects these names together. History is not random. Allah guides humanity continuously through chosen messengers. Another beautiful passage appears in Surah Sad, 38:45-47. Allah commands the Prophet Muhammad, "Remember our servants Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Yaqub, men of strength and insight." What kind of strength? Military power? Political authority? Physical ability? The classical scholars answer unanimously. The strength praised here is strength of faith, strength of obedience, strength of patience, strength of certainty. The verse continues by saying that Allah purified them with a special quality. The constant remembrance of the hereafter. This description reveals one of Ishaq's defining characteristics. He never became distracted by worldly success. He managed wealth. He led a family. He cared for livestock. He resolved disputes. Yet his heart remained attached to eternal life. Modern believers often struggle with balancing worldly responsibilities and spiritual priorities. Ishaq's example demonstrates that both can coexist. One may work diligently without becoming attached to temporary possessions. Another remarkable mention appears in Surah Maryam, 19:49-50. After Ibrahim separated himself from idol worshippers, Allah says, "We granted him Ishaq and Yaqub, and each we made a prophet. We bestowed upon them of our mercy and granted them an honorable reputation among later generations." This promise has clearly been fulfilled. Thousands of years have passed. Empires have disappeared. Languages have changed. Yet billions of people continue speaking the names of Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Yaqub with honor. Only Allah can preserve a reputation across millennia. Human fame fades. Divine honor remains. In Surah Al-Anbiya, 21:72-73, Allah says, "We granted him Ishaq, and as an additional gift, Yaqub. We made all of them righteous. We made them leaders guiding by our command." Notice another important detail. Leadership came from Allah. Not elections. Not military conquest. Not inheritance alone. Divine leadership belongs to those whom Allah chooses because of righteousness. The verses continue. We inspired them to perform good deeds, establish prayer, and give charity. This short description summarizes prophetic leadership perfectly. Teach goodness. Establish worship. Care for people. Everything else becomes secondary. Classical tafsir repeatedly emphasizes that every Quranic mention of Ishaq shares one remarkable characteristic. Not a single verse criticizes him. Not one. Every mention associates him with blessing, guidance, mercy, prophethood, righteousness, leadership, or Allah's covenant. This consistent pattern reflects his exceptional rank among Allah's messengers. The Quran also teaches an important lesson through what it does not mention. Many historical details preserved elsewhere receive no attention. The Quran omits unnecessary information because its purpose is guidance. Allah tells believers everything they need to know for faith and salvation. Curiosity about history has value. But guidance always remains the priority. When all the Quranic verses concerning Ishaq are studied together, one truth becomes unmistakably clear. His life was never meant to draw attention toward himself. Every blessing pointed toward Allah. Every honor reflected Allah's mercy. Every success fulfilled Allah's promise. He became exactly what Allah had announced before his birth. A righteous prophet. A faithful servant. A guardian of the covenant. A father of prophets. And one of the greatest examples of quiet, unwavering devotion to the Lord of all creation. The story of Prophet Ishaq, peace be upon him, does not end with the verses of the Quran alone. For over 14 centuries, Muslim scholars carefully preserved authentic narrations of Prophet Muhammad that mention Ishaq and explain his noble status. Although the number of authentic hadiths specifically about Ishaq is much smaller than those concerning prophets like Musa, Isa, or Ibrahim, every authentic narration presents him with the highest respect and confirms his honored position among Allah's greatest messengers. These narrations complete the picture drawn by the Quran. They remind believers that every prophet belongs to one united brotherhood whose mission never changed. The Prophet Muhammad once explained this beautiful reality using words that have become famous throughout Islamic history. In an authentic hadith recorded in both Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, he said, "The prophets are paternal brothers. Their mothers are different, but their religion is one." The scholars explain this profound statement carefully. The different mothers symbolize the different laws and circumstances given to various prophets across history. Noah lived in one age, Ibrahim in another. Musa received the Torah. Isa received the Injil. Muhammad received the Quran. Their legal rulings differed in some matters according to Allah's wisdom. But their father is described as one, meaning their foundation was identical. Every prophet, including Ishaq, called humanity toward Tawhid. There has never been more than one true God. There has never been more than one true path of sincere submission to Him. Another authentic narration places Ishaq within one of the most honored family lineages in all of creation. The Prophet Muhammad said that Allah chose Kinana from among the descendants of Ismail, chose Quraysh from Kinana, chose Banu Hashim from Quraysh, and then chose him from Banu Hashim. Although this narration primarily explains the lineage of Muhammad through Prophet Ismail, Muslim scholars point out an equally important implication. Allah honored both branches of Ibrahim's family. Through Ismail came the seal of the prophets. Through Ishaq came numerous earlier prophets entrusted with revelation. Neither branch diminishes the other. Together they complete the historical fulfillment of Allah's promise to Ibrahim. One of the most remarkable authentic narrations mentioning Ishaq concerns the night journey and ascension, known as Al-Isra wal-Miraj. When Prophet Muhammad was taken through the heavens, authentic hadith describe him meeting several prophets. The narrations mention Adam, then Isa and Yahya, then Yusuf, then Idris, then Harun, then Musa, finally Ibrahim. Although Ishaq is not specifically listed among those encountered in every narration of Miraj, scholars explain that his absence from this particular sequence does not lessen his rank. Allah selected specific prophets for that meeting according to His own wisdom. The Quran itself repeatedly confirms Ishaq's honored status independently. Another narration recorded by Imam Ahmad and supported by many scholars describes the noble genealogy of the prophets. Islam consistently emphasizes that prophethood represents Allah's deliberate choice. No family earns prophethood through bloodline alone. Rather, Allah repeatedly selects righteous servants from among humanity according to His perfect knowledge. This principle becomes especially important when studying Ishaq. His descendants produced numerous prophets. Yet not every descendant became a prophet. Some remained righteous believers. Others abandoned guidance altogether. The lesson is clear. Honor belongs to faith, not ancestry. One authentic hadith narrated by Abu Hurairah describes Prophet Yusuf as saying, "The noble son of the noble son of the noble son of the noble was Yusuf, the son of Yaqub, the son of Ishaq, the son of Ibrahim." This narration appears in Sahih al-Bukhari. Notice how the Prophet Muhammad describes this family. 4 consecutive generations of prophets. Ibrahim, Ishaq, Yaqub, Yusuf. No other family in recorded history contains such an extraordinary succession of prophetic leadership. The hadith honors each generation equally. Every father faithfully prepared the next. Every son continued the mission entrusted by Allah. Scholars often pause while explaining this narration because it reveals one of history's greatest family legacies. Greatness was transmitted through faith rather than wealth. The Prophet also repeatedly prohibited believers from insulting or degrading any prophet. The Quran commands Muslims to believe in all of Allah's messengers without discrimination. Classical scholars explain that this includes Ishaq exactly as it includes Adam, Noah, Musa, Isa, and Muhammad. Respecting every prophet forms part of Islamic belief itself. Rejecting even one messenger contradicts the unity of revelation established throughout the Quran. Another fascinating discussion among the scholars concerns why authentic hadith contain relatively few detailed stories about Ishaq. The answer reflects the methodology of revelation. The Prophet Muhammad primarily explained verses of the Quran and addressed the needs of his own community. Since the Quran presents Ishaq mainly as part of the covenant connecting Ibrahim and Yaqub, the Sunnah follows that same emphasis. Rather than repeating long historical narratives, the hadith focus upon the theological lessons derived from his life. Classical muhaddithin such as Imam an-Nawawi and Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani frequently note that the absence of lengthy narrations never indicates lesser importance. Many prophets receive only brief mention in authentic hadith while maintaining enormous status before Allah. Rank is determined by Allah, not by the quantity of historical reports. The scholars also discuss another beautiful lesson drawn from the prophetic lineage. When believers mention Ibrahim, Ishaq, Yaqub, Yusuf, Musa, Harun, Dawud, Sulaiman, Zachariah, Yahya, Isa, and Muhammad, they are not remembering isolated historical figures. They are remembering one continuous family of guidance. Generation after generation, Allah renewed his covenant. When one prophet completed his mission, another continued carrying the light. This continuity demonstrates Allah's mercy toward humanity. He never abandoned mankind without guidance. Every era received messengers. Every nation received reminders according to Allah's wisdom. Ishaq occupies one of the most important positions within this chain. Without him, Yaqub would not have been prepared. Without Yaqub, Yusuf's story would never unfold. Without that lineage, much of sacred history would look entirely different. The Prophet Muhammad also taught believers to send peace upon all prophets. Whenever Muslims read the names of Allah's messengers, they naturally say, "Peace be upon him." This simple phrase carries profound meaning. It is a prayer, a sign of respect, a recognition that every prophet fulfilled an immense responsibility while enduring extraordinary trials. When believers say, Ishaq, peace be upon him, they participate in a tradition practiced by Muslims for more than 14 centuries. The classical scholars conclude their discussions of Ishaq with a beautiful observation. His life demonstrates that not every prophet is remembered because of dramatic miracles witnessed by crowds. Some are remembered because they quietly preserved the truth. Some changed history through patience rather than confrontation. Some became bridges connecting one generation of revelation to the next. Ishaq belonged to that remarkable group. He protected the covenant entrusted by Ibrahim. He raised Yaqub upon Tawhid. He safeguarded the foundation upon which countless later prophets would stand. And because he fulfilled that trust with complete sincerity, Allah immortalized his name in the Quran, honored him in the authentic Sunnah, and preserved his legacy among believers until the last day. As the centuries passed, the memory of Prophet Ishaq, peace be upon him, spread far beyond the valleys of Canaan. His life became part of the collective memory of civilization stretching from the Middle East to Europe, Africa, and eventually the Americas. Historians, theologians, archaeologists, linguists, and scholars of comparative religion have all studied his life from different perspectives. Yet despite the diversity of opinions, one reality remains undeniable. The historical footprint of Ishaq is unlike that of ordinary men. He was not remembered because he founded an empire. He was remembered because he became the father of a prophetic civilization. To understand his historical importance, we must first understand the world in which he lived. Most historians place the lifetime of Ishaq somewhere during the Middle Bronze Age, approximately the early 2nd millennium BCE. While exact dates remain uncertain and are debated among historians, archaeologists generally agree that the regions associated with Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Yaqub belonged to a period when Canaan consisted of independent city-states rather than a unified kingdom. These cities were connected by trade rather than political unity. Each possessed its own ruler, its own economy, its own local customs, its own religious centers. Between these settlements stretched vast grazing lands occupied by shepherds like Prophet Ishaq and his family. Unlike urban kings, the patriarchal families moved seasonally according to water and pasture. This nomadic lifestyle shaped every aspect of daily life. Large tents replaced permanent houses. Livestock represented wealth. Wells determined survival. Hospitality became essential because travelers crossing the wilderness depended upon generous hosts. These historical realities match remarkably well with the descriptions preserved in both Islamic historical literature and ancient Near Eastern records. Archaeologists have discovered that many settlements from this era contain defensive walls, storage facilities, granaries, and sophisticated water systems. Although archaeology cannot identify the personal tent of Prophet Ishaq or recover objects that can be conclusively linked to him, excavations throughout Canaan reveal a world entirely consistent with the environment described in sacred history. The region known today as Israel, Palestine, and parts of Jordan preserves numerous archaeological sites dating back to the Middle Bronze Age. Cities such as Hazor, Shechem, Hebron, Beersheba, and Jericho have yielded evidence of thriving communities existing during the general historical period traditionally associated with Ibrahim's family. Muslim scholars welcome archaeological discoveries when they illuminate historical context, while maintaining an important distinction. Archaeology may explain the setting. Revelation explains the truth. A broken wall can reveal how people lived. Only Allah reveals why prophets were sent. One of the most fascinating discoveries made by archaeologists concerns ancient wells. Throughout Canaan, researchers have uncovered carefully engineered wells dug thousands of years ago. Some descend dozens of feet below ground level. Others include elaborate stone linings designed to prevent collapse. These discoveries help modern readers understand why disputes over wells became so significant during the lifetime of Ishaq. Water was not merely convenient. It determined whether an entire community survived. Every well represented life itself. This historical background gives greater appreciation to the patience demonstrated by Ishaq when conflicts arose over access to water. Rather than shedding blood for temporary possession, he repeatedly chose peace. His decisions reflected prophetic wisdom rather than tribal pride. Another important historical question concerns the language spoken by Prophet Ishaq. The Quran does not specify his spoken language. However, historians generally believe that the people of Canaan during that period communicated using Northwest Semitic languages closely related to what later developed into Hebrew, Aramaic, and Phoenician. Arabic also belongs to the same larger Semitic language family. This explains why many ancient names appear similar across different Semitic languages. Ishaq, Yaqub, Ibrahim, Yusuf. These names have traveled across centuries while retaining recognizable forms. The preservation of these names across multiple civilizations demonstrates the enduring influence of the prophetic tradition. Historians also study the trade routes passing through Canaan during Ishaq's lifetime. The region occupied a strategic position connecting Egypt to Mesopotamia. Caravans carrying spices, textiles, metals, precious stones, livestock, and agricultural products regularly crossed these roads. Travelers from distant lands encountered one another in marketplaces and temporary camps. This constant movement exposed local populations to many different cultures and religions. It also explains why prophets repeatedly encountered diverse communities rather than isolated tribes. Canaan stood at the crossroads of the ancient world. Spiritually, however, the surrounding civilizations continued drifting away from Tawhid. Archaeological discoveries reveal temples dedicated to numerous deities worshipped by the Canaanites. Among these were Baal, El, Asherah, Anat, and several local gods associated with fertility, storms, agriculture, and warfare. People offered sacrifices, built idols, conducted seasonal rituals. sought blessings from false gods created by human imagination. Against this background, the message carried by Ibrahim and continued through Ishaq became even more extraordinary. One God. No idols. No intermediaries worthy of worship. No partnership with the Creator. This simple message challenged nearly every religious system surrounding them. Islamic historians emphasize that the prophets never adapted Tawhid to fit popular culture. Instead, they invited culture back toward Tawhid. Another fascinating area of historical research concerns tribal genealogy. Ancient Near Eastern societies carefully preserved family lineages. Genealogy determined inheritance, leadership, marriage alliances, property rights, historical identity. This explains why the descendants of Ishaq became known through Yaqub and his 12 sons. Genealogies were not preserved merely for curiosity. They shaped the structure of entire civilizations. The Quran acknowledges these family connections while constantly reminding believers that lineage alone cannot save a person. Faith remains the true measure before Allah. Modern historians continue debating many chronological details concerning Ishaq's life. Exact dates differ. Specific locations remain discussed. Certain historical reconstructions vary from one scholar to another. Islam encourages intellectual honesty regarding such matters. Where authentic revelation speaks, believers accept with certainty. Where revelation remains silent, historians may investigate while recognizing the limits of historical evidence. This balance between faith and scholarship has characterized Islamic civilization for centuries. The greatest Muslim historians never confused probability with certainty. They distinguished carefully between revealed truth and historical reconstruction. This methodological honesty continues inspiring researchers today. Viewed through the lens of history, Prophet Ishaq stands at one of civilization's most important crossroads. Behind him stood Ibrahim, the friend of Allah. Before him stretched generations of prophets who would transform the spiritual history of humanity. His own earthly life appeared peaceful. Yet its consequences echoed across millennia. Sometimes history changes through dramatic revolutions. Sometimes it changes because one righteous servant faithfully preserves the truth until the next generation is ready to carry it forward. That faithful guardian was Prophet Ishaq, peace be upon him. Every prophet left behind lessons that reached far beyond the time in which he lived. Some lessons were preserved through miracles. Others through revelation. Others through the example of a life lived entirely for Allah. Prophet Ishaq, peace be upon him, belongs to the third category. His life was not dominated by wars, dramatic confrontations, or spectacular public miracles. Instead, it became a masterpiece of patience, gratitude, family leadership, and unwavering faith. That is precisely why his story remains deeply relevant today. Modern society often teaches that success belongs to the loudest voice. The life of Ishaq teaches something very different. True greatness often grows quietly. One righteous decision. One sincere prayer. One honest action. Repeated consistently over an entire lifetime. Can change history forever. The first lesson from Ishaq's life is that Allah's timing is always perfect. His parents, Ibrahim and Sarah, waited for decades before receiving the child Allah had promised. From a human perspective, the promise appeared impossible. Old age had arrived. Hope seemed distant. Every natural explanation suggested that the opportunity had passed. Yet Allah fulfilled His promise exactly when He had decreed. This teaches believers never to confuse delay with denial. Many prayers appear unanswered because Allah is preparing something greater. The Quran repeatedly reminds believers that Allah knows while human beings do not. Modern life encourages impatience. People expect immediate success. Immediate wealth. Immediate recognition. Immediate solutions. The prophets remind humanity that patience is often the road chosen by Allah for His greatest servants. The second lesson is the importance of raising the next generation. Ishaq understood that his greatest responsibility was not expanding his wealth. It was preparing Yaqub. History rarely remembers how much property someone owned. History remembers how they influenced future generations. Every conversation between Ishaq and Yaqub became an investment in the future. Parents today often focus on providing material comfort. The prophets focused first upon faith. A child who inherits millions but loses belief has inherited very little. A child who inherits faith possesses a treasure beyond calculation. The third lesson concerns gratitude. Throughout every stage of his life, Ishaq thanked Allah. He thanked Allah before receiving blessings. He thanked Allah after receiving blessings. He thanked Allah during hardship. He thanked Allah during prosperity. Gratitude was not an occasional act. It became his way of living. The Quran repeatedly connects gratitude with increase. Not merely increase in wealth. Increase in peace. Increase in faith. Increase in contentment. Modern society often measures happiness by possessions. The prophets measured happiness by closeness to Allah. The fourth lesson is patience without weakness. When conflicts arose over wells, Ishaq chose peace whenever justice allowed. Some people mistake patience for surrender. Islam never teaches cowardice. Rather, it teaches wisdom. There is a difference between defending truth and fighting every argument. The strongest person is not the one who wins every dispute. The strongest person is the one who refuses to let anger control his heart. This lesson appears repeatedly throughout the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad. Strength begins with self-control. The fifth lesson concerns leadership. Ishaq never demanded authority. People trusted him because of his honesty. Leadership built upon fear disappears when fear disappears. Leadership built upon character survives for generations. Modern organizations spend enormous resources trying to create effective leaders. The prophets demonstrate that leadership begins long before someone receives a position. It begins with honesty, humility, justice, mercy, reliability. The sixth lesson is family unity. The household of Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Yaqub remained united by one purpose: the worship of Allah. Modern families often share houses without sharing values. The prophets understood that true unity begins with common belief. Different personalities can live together peacefully when their hearts face the same Creator. Esau and Yaqub possessed different strengths. Yet Ishaq continued guiding both with fairness and compassion. The seventh lesson is never becoming attached to worldly success. Although Allah blessed Ishaq with prosperity, wealth never became his identity. His identity remained servant of Allah. Modern culture often encourages people to define themselves by careers, bank accounts, social status, or public recognition. The Quran consistently rejects these measurements. Honor belongs to righteousness. Nothing else. The eighth lesson is preserving truth. Many people admire those who begin movements. History equally depends upon those who faithfully preserve them. Ibrahim established the covenant. Ishaq protected it. Yaqub continued it. Every generation fulfilled a different responsibility. Not everyone is called to begin something new. Sometimes Allah calls a believer to faithfully protect what already exists. This responsibility remains equally noble. The ninth lesson is trusting Allah during uncertainty. When famine struck Canaan, human reasoning suggested migration. Allah instructed Ishaq to remain. He obeyed. Faith sometimes requires walking in a direction opposite to worldly calculations. Believers trust that Allah sees realities hidden from human eyes. The 10th lesson is perhaps the greatest of all. Live in such a way that your legacy continues after your death. Prophet Ishaq left behind no palace, no empire, no military victories. Yet thousands of years later, his name remains honored. His descendants changed world history. His example continues inspiring believers across every continent. The Prophet Muhammad taught that when a person dies, his deeds end except for three things: continuous charity, beneficial knowledge, and a righteous child who prays for him. The life of Ishaq beautifully combines all three. He spread knowledge. He lived a life benefiting others. He raised righteous descendants whose guidance reached countless nations. Modern people often ask how they will be remembered. The prophets asked a different question. Will Allah be pleased with me? That single question changes every priority. It changes every decision. It changes every ambition. Because worldly remembrance eventually fades, Allah's pleasure remains forever. Looking back across the entire life of Prophet Ishaq, one truth becomes unmistakably clear. He was never the loudest prophet. He was never the most politically powerful. He was never remembered because of spectacular military victories. He became great because he remained faithful every single day. He worshipped Allah sincerely. He honored his parents. He loved his family. He treated people justly. He remained patient during hardship. He remained grateful during prosperity. He preserved the covenant. He prepared the next generation. He fulfilled every trust Allah placed upon him. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. History is not changed only by extraordinary moments. History is changed by ordinary days lived with extraordinary faith. That was the life of Prophet Ishaq, peace be upon him. A quiet servant. A faithful prophet. A guardian of Tawhid. A father of prophets. And one of the greatest examples of steadfast devotion ever to walk the earth. The story of Prophet Ishaq, peace be upon him, is not merely the biography of one righteous man. It is the story of how Allah preserves guidance across generations. When we step back and look at the entire timeline of sacred history, we begin to understand that every prophet occupied a precise place within Allah's perfect plan. Adam laid the foundation of humanity. Nuh preserved mankind after the flood. Ibrahim became the father of prophets. Ishaq protected the covenant. Yaqub strengthened the believing family. Yusuf demonstrated patience and forgiveness. Musa confronted tyranny. Dawud established justice. Sulayman ruled with wisdom. Isa reminded people of mercy. Finally, Muhammad completed the chain of revelation for all humanity. Seen from this perspective, Ishaq was one of the most important links in that unbroken chain. Remove one link. The chain breaks. Keep every link strong. The light continues reaching future generations. This is exactly what happened through Prophet Ishaq. His life reminds believers that Allah's plans often unfold quietly. When the angels announced his birth, no empire celebrated. No king understood the significance of that moment. No historian recorded that one elderly couple's child would eventually become the ancestor of numerous prophets. Yet Allah already knew. The greatest events in history are not always recognized when they first begin. Many of Allah's greatest blessings enter the world in complete silence. A newborn child. A sincere prayer. A single act of faith. Years later, the world discovers their importance. Throughout history, countless civilizations attempted to build permanent greatness. The pharaohs built pyramids. Mesopotamian kings built towering palaces. Roman emperors constructed magnificent cities. Powerful rulers engraved their names upon stone monuments, believing future generations would never forget them. Yet today many tourists walk among those ruins without remembering the names of the kings who ordered their construction. Time humbles every empire. The prophets built something entirely different. They built hearts. A righteous heart survives long after stone monuments crumble. That is why the names of Ibrahim, Ishaq, Yaqub, Yusuf, Musa, Isa, and Muhammad remain alive across the world while countless ancient rulers have faded into history. The Quran repeatedly teaches believers to travel through the earth and observe what became of earlier nations. Not merely to admire ruins, but to understand a lesson. Power without faith disappears. Faith outlives power. The life of Ishaq perfectly illustrates this truth. He possessed no vast kingdom. Yet his influence reached farther than the borders of every kingdom surrounding him. His descendants carried revelation across centuries. His example shaped prophets. His patience inspired believers. His faith became part of the eternal message preserved by Allah himself. One remarkable aspect of Ishaq's story is how little attention he gave to himself. Everything pointed back toward Allah. His miraculous birth pointed toward Allah's power. His prophethood pointed toward Allah's guidance. His family pointed toward Allah's covenant. His peaceful character pointed toward Allah's mercy. His life teaches an essential principle of Islam. The greatest servants never seek to make themselves the center of attention. They direct hearts toward their Creator. This same quality appears throughout the lives of all the prophets. Nuh did not invite people to admire Nuh. He invited them to worship Allah. Musa did not seek personal glory. He confronted Pharaoh so people would recognize Allah. Isa called people toward Allah. Muhammad repeatedly declared that he was only Allah's servant and messenger. Likewise, Ishaq lived his entire life pointing beyond himself. This humility explains why Allah elevated his rank. The Prophet Muhammad taught that whoever humbles himself for the sake of Allah will be elevated by Allah. No life demonstrates this principle more beautifully than the lives of the prophets. As modern readers examine the biography of Ishaq, another lesson emerges. History often celebrates visible success. Allah often values invisible faithfulness. Millions of people perform acts of sincerity every day that no newspaper records. Parents quietly teaching children to pray. Someone giving charity without seeking recognition. A person forgiving another instead of taking revenge. Someone remaining honest despite financial loss. These acts rarely become headlines. Yet before Allah, they may outweigh the achievements of kings. Ishaq lived precisely this kind of life. Quiet. Steady. Faithful. Consistent. His legacy reminds believers that Allah never overlooks hidden righteousness. Every sincere prayer is heard. Every patient tear is known. Every sacrifice made for Allah is recorded. Nothing is forgotten. The Quran repeatedly promises that Allah never allows the reward of those who do good to be lost. This promise sustained every prophet throughout history. It continues sustaining believers today. Looking across sacred history, the family of Ibrahim remains one of the greatest examples of Allah's blessings upon righteous households. Through Ismail came the final messenger, Muhammad. Through Ishaq came Yaqub and a long succession of prophets entrusted with divine revelation. 2 branches. 1 source. 1 message. 1 creator. This unity forms one of the central teachings of Islam. The prophets were never rivals. They were partners in one divine mission. Every generation continued where the previous generation had finished. The chain never broke until Allah completed revelation through the Quran. Perhaps the greatest honor granted to Ishaq appears in the words of Allah himself. Whenever Allah mentions him in the Quran, he speaks with praise. He calls him righteous. He calls him guided. He calls him blessed. He calls him a prophet. There is no greater testimony than the testimony of the Lord of the worlds. Human praise eventually fades. Allah's praise remains forever. As we close the story of Prophet Ishaq, peace be upon him, we are left with a timeless truth. Not every servant changes history through dramatic miracles. Some change history through lifelong faithfulness. Not every hero stands upon a battlefield. Some stand upon a prayer mat before dawn. Not every victory is won with a sword. Some victories are won by resisting temptation, remaining patient, raising righteous children, protecting the truth, and trusting Allah when no one else understands His wisdom. That was the life of Prophet Ishaq. A miracle before birth. A prophet chosen by Allah. A devoted son of Ibrahim. A loving husband. A wise father. A guardian of the covenant. A bridge between generations. A servant whose quiet obedience helped preserve the light of Tawhid until it reached every corner of the world. May Allah send His peace and blessings upon Prophet Ishaq, upon his father Ibrahim, upon his son Yaqub, upon all the prophets and messengers, and may He grant us hearts that remain as sincere, patient, grateful, and steadfast as theirs. Thus ends the remarkable story of Prophet Ishaq, peace be upon him, whose life continues reminding humanity that the greatest legacy any person can leave behind is unwavering faith in the one true Creator.